Hey guys, tonight we step back into the crooked cobblestone lanes of medieval Europe, where the streets are narrow, the air is thick with chimney smoke, and the concept of fresh and clean is about as rare as a unicorn sighting. You're about to wander into the daily reality of a world where people lived cheek by jowl, rats ran freely, and sanitation was more rumor than practice. Forget your modern comforts, hot showers, minty toothpaste, or even the faint hope of deodorant. Here, you're lucky if you can find a wooden bucket of water that hasn't already been shared by 6 other people and a passing dog. And if you think you'd breeze through this era with your 21st century immune system, let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive past your first week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe button. Only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the medieval streets, and the first thing you notice isn't the architecture or the occasional ringing of a church, but it's the smell. A heavy cocktail of rotting food scraps, animal dung, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies clings to the air like an unwelcome hug. People often tossed chamber pot contents straight out the window, and the result was that sidewalks became obstacle courses of refuse. Mainstream fact: many cities did have rules about when you could fling waste into the streets. Some decreed you had to yell a warning first, usually something like "Gordilu." In parts of Scotland, imagine trying to dodge that at night. After a few mugs of ale, you shuffle past a butcher's stall, where offal lies exposed to the sun, buzzing with flies, mixing its stench with the nearby tanner's vats of urine-soaked hides. Hygiene here isn't just an inconvenience, it's a sensory onslaught. Even the water used to wash or cook is questionable. Wells often lay too close to cesspits, meaning one bad rainstorm could transform drinking water into a potion of illness. Historians still argue whether medieval people realized this connection or just chalked sickness up to bad air. Either way, the outcome was the same: a lot of people coughing, sweating, and hoping their chosen saint had enough pull to save them. You duck under a hanging sign marked with a rough symbol, a crude, hand-painted crescent moon. That's a tavern, where beer and ale are safer to drink than water. Fermentation kills a few germs, but it doesn't stop the breath of the patrons from reeking like a stable. The crowd inside, loud, sweaty, layered in wool and leather that hasn't seen soap in months. Quirky tidbit: people sometimes carried little pomanders, tiny balls filled with herbs and spices to sniff when the stink became unbearable. Imagine clutching a medieval version of a car air freshener to survive your evening. You turn a corner and stumble into a marketplace where the chaos of sounds and smells swells even more. Chickens flap from baskets. Fishmongers holler about their catch, while the fish itself has clearly been out for far too long, and children run barefoot, their toes blackened with dirt. You can't help but think about the prostitutes who also navigate these same streets nightly. If everyday hygiene for regular townsfolk is this abysmal, what about for women working in the most intimate of trades? You're not there yet, but the setting is important. Their lives unfold in the middle of this sensory battlefield. You pause near a public fountain ornamental on the outside, questionable on the inside. Decorative spouts, shaped like lions or angels, pour water into stone. Basins and townsfolk gather to fill buckets. But children splash in it, animals drink from it, and sometimes washerwomen scrub rags right in the same basin. One poor traveler dips his cup, drinks deeply, and within days he'll likely regret that decision. Hygiene here isn't about prevention, about surviving day to day without succumbing to the invisible world of germs. Nobody understands yet. Let's sneak into a tenement now. You climb a creaking staircase into a cramped room shared by two families. Beds are stuffed with straw, changed rarely, if ever. You run your hand over the mattress and feel it crunch with tiny pests. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs are constant companions. Quirky aside, some households believed hanging dried herbs above the bed might chase away lice. Spoiler, it didn't, but it made for fragrant decor. You can picture a prostitute finishing her evening's work, collapsing onto this very bed, scratching and shifting, knowing she rise tomorrow to do it all over again. Step outside again, and you hear a preacher's voice echoing from the church steps, railing about sin, impurity, and the dangers of lust. He doesn't just mean spiritual purity. He's warning that physical dirt is tied to the corruption of the soul. Bathing too often, he suggests, might actually tempt you toward sinful vanity. Historians still argue whether this rhetoric really stopped people from washing, or whether ordinary folks simply lacked access to water and facilities. Either way, sermons like this hang in the air like smoke, shaping how townsfolk think about bodies, cleanliness, and morality. The night draws in, and as torches flicker along the streets, you notice how the shadows play tricks. Behind shutters and doorways, women peer out, ready to begin their work. Their hygiene habits, good, bad, or desperate, are forged in the very conditions you've just walked through. Cramped streets, foul water, smoky air, and a culture suspicious of washing. You already know this isn't going to be a gentle bedtime. Fairy tale lit's survival, compromise, and the constant balancing act between allure and the impossibility of staying clean. You step back for a moment, breathing in through your nose, and instantly regret it. You've made it only through a single day in this medieval town, and you already long for the sterile hum of a bathroom fan and the minty snap of toothpaste. But hold on, because this is just the beginning. You're about to descend deeper into the world where prostitutes made their living. Bathhouses, brothels, powders, perfumes, and problems you'll be scratching at all night long. And remember, tonight's journey isn't just about filth. It's about the resilience of people who managed to carve out survival, desire, and livelihood in conditions you'd barely tolerate for an afternoon. You ease onward through the night air, your footsteps guiding you toward one of the most controversial spaces in medieval towns, the bathhouse. You spot its warm glow before you even reach the door. Steam drifts out through the cracks in the shutters, carrying with it the faint mingling of rosemary, sweat, and smoke. To your modern brain, the idea of a communal bathhouse feels oddly hopeful. Finally, a chance for people to wash off the grime. But as you'll soon see, bathhouses in this era are less about crisp hygiene and more about complex social performance, suspicion, and whispered scandal. The door creaks open, and you step into a humid haze. Wooden tubs line the room, filled with steaming water that's already been used by a parade of customers. Women laugh in one corner, while men debate politics in another. People share drinks right there in the water, and it's not hard to imagine chunks of food and droplets of ale spilling into the bath. A musician strums a lute by the wall, adding to the atmosphere of communal leisure. Bathhouses weren't simply places to wash, they were medieval spas where gossip, negotiations, and sometimes illicit activities flowed just as freely as the water. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In many cities, bathhouses were originally encouraged. Officials liked them because they kept public filth down and theoretically promoted health. In Paris, for instance, bathhouses flourished during the 13th and 14th centuries, bustling with crowds who came to warm themselves, chat, and soak. But soon, suspicions began creeping in. Moralists whispered that too much bathing stirred sinful desires. Some authorities began closing bathhouses altogether, especially during outbreaks of plague, when people feared that hot water opened pores and invited disease to creep in. Historians still argue whether bathhouses truly contributed to spreading illness, or whether they were scapegoats for larger problems like contaminated water and poor sanitation. Now, imagine yourself lowering into one of those tubs. The warmth feels good at first, easing the chill of stone streets. You relax, but then your elbow brushes against something floating, maybe a stray leaf of rosemary, or maybe something less appealing. You glance over at the person beside you, who is happily drinking spiced wine and wiping his beard into the water you now share. This isn't the refreshing hot shower you're used to. It's more like sitting in medieval soup. For prostitutes. Bathhouses represented both opportunity and risk. On the one hand, they could use them as discreet venues to meet clients. A dimly lit bathhouse, with steam clouding the air, offered cover for arrangements that might otherwise draw scandal in public. But on the other hand, reputation clung to bathhouses like steam on your skin. A woman seen too often stepping into one might instantly be labeled immoral, whether or not she was working. It was a balancing act. Wash and risk judgment, or skip the bath and risk smelling like a barrel of spoiled fish. Quirky tidbit time. Some bathhouses tried to enhance their image by flavoring the water. They'd toss in herbs like sage, chamomile, or even crushed flowers, hoping to mask the collective odor. In some records, attendants are said to have added onion or garlic peels as well, not quite the scent of a luxury spa. You can almost laugh, imagining someone sinking into a tub and thinking, ah yes, nothing says relaxation like smelling faintly of stew. You pull yourself back out of the water and dry off with rough linen. Towels, when available, were often shared, which makes you scratch at your skin just thinking about it. Still, for many people, this was the only chance to wash at all. Imagine prostitutes trying to balance this system, perhaps arranging to sneak into the bathhouse early in the morning when fewer eyes watched, or perhaps bringing along perfumes later to disguise the fact that they hadn't been able to wash that week. Their profession depended on appearances, but appearances were held together with patchwork solutions. As you leave the bathhouse, the chill night air clings again, mixing with the dampness still on your skin. The crowd outside offers another perspective. Some townsfolk glare suspiciously at those exiting, convinced that bathhouses were dens of immorality. In fact, religious authorities often condemned them as fronts for brothels. A few councils even passed ordinances banning women from certain bathhouses unless accompanied by a male relative. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was about control, morality, and the constant policing of women's bodies. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly abandoned bathing altogether after the Black Death. Some suggest that the closures of bathhouses signaled a cultural shift toward believing water was dangerous. Others argue that private washing continued, just in less visible, smaller ways. Wooden basins in homes, rinses with vinegar or herbal sponges. The debate matters because it shapes how we imagine prostitutes surviving day to day. Were they truly unable to wash, resorting only to perfumes and powders? Or did they still sneak in small rituals of cleanliness that records often overlook? You wander down the street now, away from the warmth of the baths, and feel the return of the ever-present city stench. But your mind lingers on that steamy room. Bathhouses were both salvation and suspicion, havens and hazards. For you, it was an amusing visitum, comfortable, smelly, but survivable. For a prostitute, it could mean the difference between attracting customers or being labeled unclean, between scraping together survival or being shunned, and the irony. In a world where nearly everyone smelled, where even kings and queens dealt with fleas and lice, prostitutes were often judged most harshly for failing to seem fresh. It's like expecting someone to run a bakery during a flour shortage. Impossible demands, layered on the already impossible. You step back into the street, thinking about the contradictions of the medieval bathhouse, a place meant for hygiene, yet tangled in scandal, a place meant for community, yet dripping with suspicion. And for the women who depended on appearance for their livelihood, it was a daily gamble: bathe and risk your reputation, or skip it and risk your income. Either way, you're left scratching at your skin and longing for soap. You push onward, lantern light bouncing off cobblestones slick with evening mist, and you soon come to the heart of the city's lifeline, the wells, fountains, and rivers where everyone must fetch their water. Imagine lugging your heavy wooden bucket down crooked alleys, only to find yourself at a crowded well where the water looks suspiciously murky. In the medieval world, water wasn't a neutral background element. It was a constant gamble. Every swallow, every splash on your skin carried the risk of sickness. For prostitutes, whose livelihoods relied on intimate contact, that gamble weighed even heavier. You lean over the stone lip of a town well, hearing the splash echo far below. The water looks dark, shadowed, and you can't tell if it's clean or tainted. Mainstream fact: in many medieval towns, wells were dug frighteningly close to cesspits and latrines. With no modern sewage systems, waste seeped through soil and into groundwater. After heavy rains, contamination was practically guaranteed. People didn't know about bacteria yet, but they noticed patterns. Drink from this well and the neighborhood falls ill. Drink from that one and maybe you're safe. Historians still argue whether medieval city dwellers connected the dots between filth and disease, or whether they leaned more on superstitions about curses and miasmas, the bad air that was thought to poison health. You shift from the well to the riverbank, where women kneel with baskets of laundry. Soap is scarce, so they scrub with lye made from ash, or with bundles of herbs. You watch as one laundress slaps a shirt against the rocks, water splashing her face. She pauses, spits, and mutters about the stink. The river, after all, carries everything upstream. Butchers dump carcass scraps. Tanners empty vats of chemicals. Households pour slop and sewage straight into the current. Yet here she is, washing a garment that will later be worn by someone in the brothel district. 4. Prostitutes. Their linen sheets, chemises, headscarves were as much a part of their trade as their words or glances. And if the wash water was foul, then clean laundry was just another layer of filth in disguise. Quirky tidbit. People sometimes believed that dipping clothing, or even bodies, into particularly cold rivers could shock disease out of them. Imagine wading into an icy current in January, teeth chattering, whispering a prayer that your cough or rash might wash away. No wonder some prostitutes might have resorted to quick rinses in rivers, especially if bathhouses were closed or too risky. A cold splash in a dark stream might not have been pleasant, but it was better than nothing. You picture yourself carrying that wooden bucket home. Water sloshes onto your clothes, leaving damp patches that smell faintly of whatever was floating in the well. Back in your small room, you set the bucket down, and maybe if you're careful you pour some into a basin for a rough wash. Prostitutes might have done the same, splashing water on their faces or soaking their feet. But here's the problem. Every bucket had to be hauled by hand. Every drop meant physical effort. So if you've got to choose between drinking, cooking, or washing, which comes first? The answer too often was not hygiene. There's a scholarly debate about whether medieval people genuinely believed water itself could be dangerous, or whether they merely avoided communal sources during outbreaks. Some chroniclers insist that after the Black Death, people feared bathing entirely, thinking that warm water opened the pores to pestilence. Others point to records of continued washing in private homes, even if rivers and wells were foul. Historians still argue whether prostitutes in particular had better or worse access to relatively clean water. Were they at the bottom of the social ladder, forced to make do with the dirtiest sources? Or, because their trade was economically useful, did they sometimes gain access to slightly better supplies through wealthier clients? As you walk away from the river, the smells cling to you. Fish guts. In your memory, you pass a child dipping a clay jug, his face lit with pride at fetching water for his family. You know what's in that jug, though, not purity, but risk. And tomorrow, that child might wake with cramps and fever. For prostitutes, who often drank the same ale or water as their clients, illness was never far. A stomach bug wasn't just uncomfortably, could be the end of their earning ability for days or weeks, pushing them closer to starvation. The streets grow quieter now, but you notice buckets lined up outside doors, waiting for collection by water carriers. In larger towns, hauling and selling water became a small industry. Imagine burly men trudging up hills with barrels strapped to their backs, delivering water to wealthier households. Prostitutes without the means to hire such services had to fetch their own, unless a sympathetic neighbor helped. You can almost see a weary woman in a coarse wool dress balancing her bucket carefully, muttering that the last thing she needs tonight is muddy water slopping into her only clean shift. Quirky aside, number 2. Some people tried filtering their water through cloth or even bread. Yes, bread. They'd pour liquid through the spongy center, hoping it would trap impurities. Did it work? Not really, but at least it made the water taste like bread. You might chuckle, but when your choices are bad water or no water, you'll try anything. You wonder whether prostitutes used similar tricks, desperate to keep their voices smooth, their skin less blemished, or simply their bellies calm enough to keep working. You pause at a fountain adorned with carved angels, water trickling from their mouths. It looks almost romantic in the torchlight, but you know better. The fountain is fed by the same pipes that run dangerously close to sex. People gather here daily, filling jars, chatting and trading gossip. Prostitutes likely strolled past too, catching whispers of potential clients or avoiding the judgmental stares of matrons who guarded their sons from bad company. But for a woman trying to rinse her hands or splash her face before a night's work, even this public fountain came with the risk of being marked as shameless for washing too publicly. Cleanliness was political. Your own skin itches now, as if imagining the grime soaking through your pores. You'd give anything for a sealed bottle of spring water. But in medieval times, survival meant making peace with uncertainty. You couldn't see the invisible killers in your cup, but you could taste the murk, smell the taint, and hope your body, your faith would endure. For prostitutes, it was an endless paradox, expected to appear alluring, yet denied the resources to stay truly clean. And every trip to the well or river reminded them that beauty here meant bravely facing the stink of survival. You keep walking, and soon the murmur of voices draws you toward a district that feels heavier, busier, almost electric in its tension. This is the brothel quarter, sometimes politely called the red light area, even in medieval chronicles. You see the lanterns swinging in doorways, painting everything with a dim orange glow. The houses here stand out, shutters slightly ajar, doorways marked with crude symbols, sometimes a red garland, sometimes nothing more than a knowing glance from a woman leaning in the doorway. You step closer, and suddenly you're immersed in the business of medieval prostitution, where the question of hygiene isn't just about health, but about money, survival, and reputation. The door creaks open to one of these houses, and you're invited inside. The floor is wooden, creaking underfoot, and the air smells of spiced wine, tallow candles, and unwashed bodies mingled with perfumes. You glance around. In one corner, a woman adjusts her linen chemise, smoothing wrinkles as though the gesture might disguise the fact that it hasn't been washed in weeks. Another arranges flowers in a chipped jug to brighten the space. They're working with what they have, crafting an atmosphere that suggests charm despite the undeniable odor of damp straw mats. Mainstream historical fact. In many cities, prostitution was officially tolerated and even regulated by authorities. Brothels were licensed, taxed, and subject to ordinances. In 14th century Paris, for example, municipal authorities designated certain streets for prostitution, and similar systems existed in London, Hamburg, and Florence. The logic was straightforward. Better to keep the trade confined and supervised than to let it scatter uncontrolled through the city. But here's the catch. Licensing didn't mean comfort. It meant rules about where prostitutes could live, when they could appear in public, and sometimes even what they could wear. And while inspectors occasionally checked brothels for cleanliness, enforcement was uneven at best. A law on paper didn't sweep out the fleas in the bedding or clean the chamber pots. You pause near one of the common rooms where clients drink. The table is sticky with spilled ale, and the benches shine with years of grease. A man boasting loudly about his wealth slams a mug down, while across from him, a woman pretends to laugh at his jokes. For her, the laughter is survival. She can't choose her clients. She can only hope they'll pay fairly and not bring illness or violence. Hygiene, in this space, is inseparable from economics. If she smells too strongly of sweat or unwashed linen, he may walk out. But if she spends too much on perfumes or laundry, she risks losing her profit margin. It's a constant tightrope. Quirky tidbit: some brothels had house rules requiring women to wash at least their hands and faces before seeing clients. But washing might mean nothing more than splashing a little water from a communal basin. In some records, prostitutes were even required to comb their hair in front of clients to give the impression of grooming. Whether the comb actually removed lice is another story, though, let's be honest, it probably just redistributed them. You imagine sitting there, comb in hand, while silently hoping no little crawlers fall onto the table mid-conversation. Step further inside, and you reach the sleeping quarters. The beds are narrow, stuffed with straw, and covered in linens that may have been laundered last month, if you're lucky. Prostitutes often had to share beds in shifts, working and sleeping in the same space without time to fully air it out. Historians still argue whether brothel keepers invested in replacing straw regularly or whether they stretched it until it turned gray and alive with fleas. Either way, the women had to make it work, sometimes sprinkling herbs or vinegar to mask the smell. You picture yourself lying down on such a bed, itchy before you've even closed your eyes. A client arrives, pulling coins from a pouch. The madam nods approvingly, but the exchange is brisk. Money first, service second. This detail matters. Prostitution was both a business and a form of survival. Women entered the trade for many reasons: poverty, abandonment, debt, or lack of other work. Some cities even required prostitutes to register, keeping official lists. But none of that paperwork scrubbed the floor or emptied the chamber pot. The women lived in cramped quarters, handling one client after another, often with little chance to freshen themselves in between. If you thought modern customer service jobs were exhausting, try surviving this without running water. And what about clothing? That was another layer of the business. Prostitutes were often forced to wear distinctive garments, bright stripes, specific colors, or headscarves so they could be recognized in public. Imagine the humiliation of walking down the street, marked out not just by your trade, but also by the expectation that your clothes, too, were stained, sweaty, and in constant need of mending. Laundry became an endless cycle. Wash what you can in dirty water, hang it in smoky air, and put it back on because there are no spares. Quirky aside, in some cities, brothels were strategically placed near bathhouses, so clients could convince themselves they were being clean by bathing first. Of course, given the bathwater was shared, that logic was questionable at best. Still, the proximity made sense. One stop for washing, another for pleasure. You can almost hear a medieval town planner saying, efficiency, while ignoring the public health disaster it really was. The noise rises around you as the evening deepens. More men arrive, laughter gets louder, and the air thickens with smoke and perfume. You notice how quickly the women adapt, shifting tone and posture. For each new client, their survival depends on the illusion of desirability, even when their bodies are weary and their clothes are clammy. Hygiene is part of the act, but it's also the part most beyond their control. Historians still argue whether prostitutes had higher standards of cleanliness compared to the general population. Some argue yes, because their trade demanded it. Others insist no, pointing to evidence of disease and squalor in brothels. The truth probably lies in the middle. They tried, but with limited tools: perfume over sweat, straw mattresses over clean linens, quick rinses over long baths. It was patchwork hygiene, improvised daily. You lean back against the doorway, taking it all in. The brothel is more than just a business. It's a stage where appearances must be managed, no matter how grim the backstage really is. And in that stagecraft, hygiene plays a starring but impossible role. You leave the building, stepping once more into the damp night air, carrying with you the realization that for prostitutes, filth wasn't just around them, it was stitched into the fabric of their working lives. And as you walk away, you can't help but mutter a joke to yourself. At least in modern hotels, you can complain about the sheets. Here, the best you can do is hope they swapped the straw before the fleas unionized. You push farther into the dim back streets, where the lamps sputter and shadows stretch long. You notice how people clutch at their clothes against the chill, wrapping layers tight, and then it strikes you. Clothing isn't just fashion, here it's armor against the cold, a badge of identity, and unfortunately, a sponge for filth. The garments of prostitutes, in particular, carry a double weight. They're expected to entice, to be colorful and noticeable, but at the same time, they're made of the same coarse fabrics as everyone else's: wool, linen, maybe fur, if fortune smiles. And because laundering is a hassle of water hauling, scrubbing, and drying in smoky air, most clothing goes weeks, sometimes months. Between washes, you reach out and touch a sleeve as someone passes. The wool feels stiff, almost greasy. That's because lanolin, a natural oil from sheep's wool, stays embedded unless thoroughly washed out. Mainstream fact: medieval people didn't wash their outer garments very often. Instead, they relied on undergarments, linen, chemises, or shirts that could be swapped and scrubbed more easily. But here's the rub: prostitutes often owned fewer changes of linen than wealthier women. A single chemise might be worn, rinsed, worn again, patched, and worn until the fabric nearly fell apart. The result: a constant layering of sweat, body, oils, and street dust. Picture yourself in one of those chemises now. At first it's soft, but after days of wear, the armpits stiffen, the neckline darkens, and the smell, well, you'd notice it long before anyone leaned close. Historians still argue whether prostitutes were given extra allowances of clothing by brothel keepers, or whether they had to fend for themselves entirely. Some city records mention brothels issuing standard uniforms, bright stripes, or mandated colors meant to mark women as public. Others suggest women patched together whatever they could afford. Either way, these clothes were far from crisp or clean. Quirky tidbit: fleas loved wool, so much so that some households tried scattering fragrant herbs like lavender or mint into closets, hoping to repel the pests. Of course, fleas weren't so easily discouraged. Imagine a prostitute smoothing her skirt before greeting a client, praying no tiny speck leaps into view. You can almost hear the sarcastic inner monologue. Ah, yes, my best accessory tonight, the flea circus. Clothing wasn't just about pest, it was also about the sensory weight it carried. Without modern detergents, garments held onto smells for dear life. Sweat, smoke from the hearth, a splash of ale from the tavern, even the tang of chamber pot contents in the street, they all soaked into the fibers. Perfumes and powders were applied not to enhance, but to mask. Prostitutes dabbed rosewater or ground herbs into the fabric, layering pleasant scents over the underlying funk. But like spraying too much cologne over gym clothes, the illusion only worked briefly. You peer into a small chamber where a prostitute carefully mends a tear in her shift. Needlework by candlelight, her fingers quick and practiced. This wasn't just thrift, it was necessity. Clothes were expensive, often valued more highly than furniture. Prostitutes couldn't simply toss garments aside. Instead, they patched, redyed, and reinvented. There's even evidence of women turning worn-out dresses inside out to stretch their lifespan. Still, the frayed seams and stubborn stains told their own story. The irony is rich. Society demanded prostitutes appear alluring, yet gave them almost no tools to maintain the freshness that allure required. Instead, the clothing itself betrayed them. Bright stripes signaling their trade, patches signaling poverty, odors signaling the daily grind. It's like being forced to walk around with a neon sign flashing all your secrets, and no chance to switch it off. Top step into the brothel common room again and notice the variety. One woman wears a faded gown, dyed a once brilliant scarlet, now dulled to rust. Another has a green skirt patched with mismatched brown. A third has simply wrapped herself in a woolen cloak, using a bright scarf as her one nod to style. Each outfit is a compromise. Enough color to attract attention, enough fabric to keep out the cold, enough patching to keep it in one piece. But nothing here would pass a modern laundry test. Historians still argue whether prostitutes, because of their contact with wealthier clients, sometimes received gifts of clothing. A nobleman, after all, might offer a cast-off gown as part of payment. But even if so, those hand-me-downs came preloaded with stains and sweat from another body. And without reliable cleaning methods, those marks lingered like ghosts in the fabric. You step back outside, and the night air sharpens. You can almost smell your own clothing after this imagined day: smoke, sweat, and damp wool. You tug at your sleeve, wishing you could strip it off and toss it in a washing machine. But here, clothing isn't disposable. It's identity, livelihood, and one more reminder that hygiene in medieval times wasn't about choice, it was about survival. And if you chuckle to yourself, thinking of your modern laundry basket and favorite detergent, remember, somewhere back then, a prostitute might have dreamed of the same thing: just a moment of clean fabric against her skin, instead of a life wrapped in the heavy weight of filth. You drift deeper into the night, turning down a crooked lane where the air feels heavy with something sweeter than smoke. A faint, powdery perfume clings to the breeze, hinting at attempts to mask the world's stench. And here you encounter Another side of medieval survival: cosmetics and cover-ups. If you thought perfumes and powders were about beauty first, think again. For prostitutes in particular, these tricks of scent and color were as much a hygiene strategy as they were a tool of allure. You duck into a small chamber lit by a single tallow candle. A woman sits at a wooden table cluttered with tiny jars, dried herbs, and scraps of fabric. She dips her fingers into a pot of white powder and dabs it onto her cheeks. It looks like flour at first, but this is her makeshift cosmetics. Chalk, sometimes lead-based mixtures, sometimes ground rice. Mainstream fact: pale skin in medieval Europe was considered beautiful, a sign of privilege, because it suggested you didn't labor in the sun. Prostitutes leaned into this, painting their faces to give an illusion of refinement. But the irony: the powders often contained lead, which over time damaged the skin, leaving sores and discoloration. Historians still argue whether women in brothels fully understood the dangers or simply accepted them as the price of appearance. She lifts a small vial of rosewater and sprinkles a few drops on her chemise. The scent blooms briefly, then fades, overwhelmed by the mustiness of fabric worn too many times. Perfumes were vital here, not luxury items, but survival tools. Imagine entertaining a client in a smoky, sweaty room. Without perfume, the smells of bodies, straw mattresses, and ale would dominate. With perfume, you at least created a brief illusion of freshness. Quirky tidbit: some recipes for medieval perfumes included rather unexpected ingredients, like civet musk, extracted from the glands of a civet cat, or ambergris, a waxy substance, from the intestines of whales. If you wore perfume containing those, you carried a scent that was simultaneously exotic and unsettling. You can picture a prostitute applying it carefully, hoping the client thinks luxury instead of why. Do I smell cat musk? You glance at her lips now, stained faintly red. How? Not lipstick from a store, but crushed berries or cochineal, a dye from insects. Sometimes women even rubbed wine onto their lips or cheeks to give them color. Imagine the taste art, sticky on the fleeting effect. This wasn't Maybelline. This was survival artistry. Fleeting masks painted onto a canvas that rarely had time to heal. And of course, cosmetics weren't just about attraction. They were also about camouflage. A woman with blemishes, sores, or pockmarks could hide them under powder. A prostitute recovering from illness might try to disguise her pallor with rouge. Cosmetics became a way to suggest health when reality told a different story. In a trade where appearance was the currency, powders and scents bought time. You step outside again, and the scent follows you. Imagine an alley full of women, each dabbed with rosewater, each carrying small pomander little metal balls filled with herbs and spices, hung from belts. They'd lift them discreetly to their noses in public, warding off stink and signaling refinement. Pomanders weren't just accessories. They were portable air fresheners, meant to shield you from the very air itself. Historians still argue whether prostitutes had consistent access to these luxuries, or whether they relied on cheaper substitutes like bundles of herbs tucked into their bodices. Some suggest that wealthier clients might gift perfumes or powders, ensuring their favorite looked fresher than the rest. Others point to records showing women making do with vinegar rinses or onion masks. The idea was that sharp smells could both disinfect and distract. Imagine leaning close to someone reeking of onion juice. Romantic, hardly effective. Maybe. Step into a brothel common room, and the cover-ups become obvious. You notice the strange layering, sweat beneath powder, perfume masking, smoke, rouge hiding pallor. The result is almost theatrical, like stepping into a stage play where everyone wears costumes that only half convince, and that's precisely what it was. Hygiene wasn't achievable, so illusion had to suffice. Quirky aside, one 15th century text suggested rubbing pigeon droppings mixed with vinegar onto the skin to brighten it. Picture that moment, a woman dabbing bird droppings onto her cheeks, muttering that at least it isn't lead powder. You almost laugh at the absurdity, but then you realize the options were few, the stakes high, and desperation drove creativity. You glance at your own reflection in a darkened window, imagining what you'd look like after such a routine. Powder settling into the creases, rouge fading unevenly, perfume evaporating while sweat resurfaces. It wouldn't hold up under modern scrutiny, but in a smoky room lit by candlelight, the illusion might just work. And that's all it had to do. The larger irony is that while cosmetics helped mask odors and dirt, they also carried risk. Lead-based powders scarred skin. Heavy perfumes sometimes triggered headaches. Some herbal concoctions irritated eyes or lungs. So, in the attempt to appear clean and appealing, women often inflicted further damage on their bodies. Hygiene wasn't just difficult, it was self-defeating. Historians still argue whether prostitutes leaned more heavily on perfumes than ordinary women. Some suggest yes, since their livelihood demanded it. Others note that even queens and noblewomen reeked of perfume to cover the same basic problem: lack of washing. Either way, scents and powders were equalizers. In a city where everyone smelled, the one who masked it best gained an edge. As you wander back into the street, the perfume lingers in your nose. You realize you've just walked through a world where cleanliness was less about soap and water and more about illusion. Prostitutes survived by crafting masks of powder, dabs of perfume, and rouge smudges, convincing clients to believe in a version of beauty that dissolved with the dawn. And maybe you smile wryly at the thought. After all, even today, people still spritz themselves with perfume after skipping a shower, or dab concealer on blemishes before facing the world. Maybe medieval cover-ups weren't so alien after all, just messier, riskier, and with a dash more civet musk. You follow the curve of another alley, darker now, where the night closes in and you begin to notice scratching sounds, some from rats in the walls, others from people themselves, shifting uncomfortably under wool hoods and linen caps. You tug at your own scalp in sympathy, because you already know what's coming: the world of hair, lice, and crawling companions. If clothing was a battlefield against dirt, then hair was the open frontier. And for prostitutes, keeping heads and bodies even remotely clean was almost impossible. You picture a woman seated on a stool, a crude wooden comb in her hand. She drags it through her tangled hair, wincing as the teeth snag. The comb is fine-toothed, carved carefully to catch lice. Mainstream fact: lice were ubiquitous in medieval Europe. Archaeologists have found combs littered with nits, proving just how widespread the problem was. And, unlike today, there were no shampoos or conditioners, no quick showers to reset the scalp. Combing was the primary line of defense, a ritual, repeated daily, sometimes with oils rubbed in to smother the pests. But here's the cruel joke. The lice always came back. You can almost feel it, that phantom itch creeping across your scalp as you imagine living in a world where nearly everyone, peasants, nobles, prostitutes, carried lice as casually as modern folks carry cell phones. Quirky tidbit. Some medieval remedies included rubbing goose fat into the hair or even using quicksilver mercury as a wash. Effective at killing lice? Maybe. Effective at keeping you healthy? Absolutely not. Imagine leaning close to a client, hair gleaming from goose fat, while silently praying you don't poison yourself faster than the bugs. You watch the woman tie her hair back with a strip of linen. Prostitutes often wore their hair uncovered indoors, letting it tumble as a sign of allure. But in the street, many were forced by law to wear distinctive head coverings. Those coverings trapped heat, sweat, and lice alike, creating little terrariums of discomfort. Historians still argue whether prostitutes were more prone to lice infestations than others, or whether the records simply exaggerated their filth as part of social shaming. After all, even kings' wigs centuries later were crawling with vermin. But for prostitutes, reputation mattered. Lice weren't just itchy. They were part of the constant judgment about unclean. Women. You step into a brothel dormitory and see the real battleground. Several women share a straw mattress, their heads close together. Lice spread eagerly in such conditions, moving from one scalp to another, making escape nearly impossible. A woman picks through her neighbor's hair by candlelight, searching for tiny white eggs. This act, nitpicking, was as much bonding as grooming. In fact, nitpicking was a recognized social behavior, one that might even bring a moment of tenderness in a world otherwise dominated by survival. Still, the relief was temporary. Within days, the eggs hatched, and the cycle began again. You imagine yourself lying on that mattress, straw rustling beneath you, scalp alive with crawling. The itch never leaves. It interrupts sleep, conversation, even work. And when you do finally scratch hard enough, tiny scabs form, ready to invite infection. In the dim world of brothels, where clients came and went without pause, lice became another invisible companion. Quirky aside, in some regions, people collected lice and used them as love charms. Yes, really, one superstition claimed that if a woman slipped a louse into her lover's food or drink, he would remain faithful. Imagine the irony. The very creature that tormented prostitutes could, in rumor at least, be repurposed for romance. You might laugh at the absurdity, but it speaks volumes about a culture where lice were so common they became woven into superstition. Hair itself carried symbolism. Long, flowing hair was linked with sexuality, and prostitutes sometimes emphasized it by letting their hair fall loose indoors. But loose hair meant easier access for lice and fleas, making it both a marketing tool and a risk. Some women cropped their hair short to manage infestations, though this could also mark them out as different, even suspicious. Historians still argue whether short hair was stigmatized or practical for prostitutes. But the trade-off was always the same: beauty versus bugs. You glance at a basin in the corner, where one woman pours vinegar into her hair. Vinegar rinses were a known method to discourage lice, though hardly foolproof. The sour smell clings afterward, leaving you wondering if the cure was worse than the infestation. Picture a client leaning close, wrinkling his nose, and muttering, "Is that salad dressing?" Yet for the woman, it was better than nothing. Step outside again, and the sound of scratching follows you in the streets. Men tug at their beards, women adjust their caps, children slap at their scalps. The whole city is alive with the quiet rhythm of itching. For prostitutes, this background hum of discomfort layered cruelly over their work. Imagine trying to maintain a lure while resisting the urge to dig your nails into your scalp mid-conversation. You've got to smile, you've got to flirt, but deep down, you're thinking about bugs. The broader irony is clear. Lice were democratic, rich or poor, noble or prostitute. Everyone scratched. But while nobles could distract themselves with silks and perfumes, prostitutes lived under the magnifying glass of moral judgment. If they itched, it wasn't seen as universal, it was used as proof of their sinful dirtiness. Hygiene here wasn't just physical, it was political, a weapon wielded against the most vulnerable. Historians still argue whether lice and fleas played significant roles in spreading major diseases, like the plague, through prostitution networks. Some say yes, pointing to the bugs' role in transmitting bacteria. Others insist the bigger culprits were fleas from rats, not lice from heads. Either way, the perception stuck. Prostitutes weren't just unclean, they were dangerous, and the humble louse became a symbol of that danger. You scratch your own head one more time, unable to resist the phantom sensation, then you smile wryly. Because even now, centuries later, just imagining lice makes you itch. That's the enduring power of this small, crawling companion, the great equalizer of medieval hygiene nightmares. And for prostitutes, living daily with the crawl and scratch, it was one more reminder that allure was always balanced on the edge of filth. You drift toward the next candlelit corner of the city, and your mind turns from hair and lice down into the very mouth itself. If the medieval body was a battlefield, then the mouth was both fortress and fault-line, teeth, gums, and breath, all constantly under siege. For prostitutes, whose work depended on close conversation, laughter, and intimacy, oral hygiene was not some cosmetic luxury. It was part of the performance. Yet, in a world without toothbrushes as we know them, the struggle against bad breath and rotten teeth was a losing game. You imagine sitting at a rough wooden table with a bowl of mint leaves scattered across it. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval people often chewed on fresh herbs, mint, parsley, sage knot, just for flavor. But to freshen breath, wealthier households sometimes carried little boxes of candied aniseeds or fennel, which served a similar purpose. Prostitutes, when they could, would chew mint before speaking with a client, hoping the sharp scent masked the deeper odor of poor diet and neglected teeth. But herbs only went so far, and when the conversation leaned closer, reality came through. You picture the teeth themselves stained by ale, chipped from hard bread, worn down by grit that crept into flour ground on stone mills. Quirky tidbit. Archaeologists studying medieval skeletons often find teeth ground flat at the tops, thanks to all that grit. Imagine trying to smile seductively with a mouth that looks like it's been sanded down. And then there was the issue of cavities. Sugar was rare, but not unknown, and honey was common enough. Add in all the carbohydrates, and you had a recipe for tooth decay. Without dentistry as we know it, the main solution for toothache was extraction, often done by a barber surgeon with iron pliers, right there in the marketplace. Historians still argue whether prostitutes had better access to dental care than common peasants. Some suggest that, because they interacted with wealthier clients, they might occasionally be gifted herbs, spices, or even rare powders to clean their teeth. Others insist the opposite, that they had fewer opportunities for care, since their status left them on the edge of respectability. The truth likely lies in the middle, occasional lucky breaks, but mostly the same grinding reality as everyone else. You lean closer to watch a woman preparing for her night's work. She lifts a small pouch filled with powdered charcoal. She dips a finger, rubs it across her teeth, grimaces, then rinses with a swig. Charcoal was a known cleaning agent, abrasive enough to scrape away residue, but harsh enough to wear down enamel over time. Imagine the gritty taste, the dark smears across your lips before you manage to rinse. Still, the effecta slightly fresher mouth was worth it. Another woman beside her prefers wine mixed with vinegar as a rinse. The sour sting burns across her tongue, making her eyes water. She spits into a bowl, coughs, then laughs at the absurdity of it. Vinegar didn't exactly sweeten the breath, but it killed some bacteria and left a sharp tang that might pass for freshness in a candlelit room. Quirky aside, some texts even recommend rinsing with urine, believed to whiten teeth thanks to ammonia. Imagine the awkwardness of explaining that choice to a client. Oh, don't mind the smell, it's medicinal. You step back into the brothel's common room, where mugs of ale are passed freely. Drinking wasn't just recreation, it was also a cover-up. Ale dulled pain, masked odors, and replaced water, which was often unsafe. But ale itself carried its own smell, malty, yeasty, sometimes sour. Add that to unbrushed teeth and a diet heavy in onions and garlic, and you've got breath that could strip paint. For prostitutes, the challenge wasn't to smell like roses, it was simply to smell less offensive than the next person. You imagine lying close to someone in this world, whispering, feeling the heat of their breath. The intimacy is real, but so is the discomfort. And yet, in that moment, both parties suspend disbelief, pretending the herbs and perfumes are enough. The illusion is as fragile as the powders on their cheeks, but it's what keeps the exchange possible. Historians still argue whether dental hygiene was truly worse in the Middle Ages than in later centuries. Some point out that, before the flood of refined sugar in the early modern period, cavities were less common. Others highlight the visible wear and poor condition of medieval teeth as evidence of daily hardship. For prostitutes, the reality was likely a mix, fewer cavities than their descendants, but more grinding, breakage, and untreated abscesses. Imagine trying to charm a client while one side of your jaw throbbed with infection. Quirky tidbit again. Some medieval remedies for toothache included pressing a live frog against the cheek, burning herbs and inhaling the smoke, or even whispering charms into the ear. Picture a prostitute sitting quietly in a corner, muttering spells to ease the ache while waiting for her next client. It sounds absurd to modern ears, but when the alternative was pain so sharp it made your eyes water, you'd try anything. You pause at the door as another woman laughs loudly, tilting her head back. Her teeth are uneven, but her confidence fills the room. That's the final piece, here performance. Hygiene wasn't just about smell or appearance. It was about selling the illusion of vitality. Even if your teeth hurt, even if your breath was questionable, you smiled, laughed, and leaned close, convincing others that you were desirable. In a world without Colgate or floss, charisma had to carry what hygiene single quotes T. And as you step back into the night air, you can't help but run your own tongue across your teeth, grateful for your toothbrush waiting at home. Because tonight, you've walked through a world where breath mints didn't exist, where dentists were butchers, and where every smile was both an invitation and a gamble. You leave the dim brothel corridor and wander toward the marketplace again, where the smells shift from perfume and sweat to something earthier, stews bubbling in iron cauldrons, loaves of bread cooling on wooden boards, barrels of salted fish leaking brine into the dirt. Food and drink defined medieval life, not just as fuel, but as another source of hygiene troubles. What went into the body came out in ways that shaped how people smelled, how they felt, and how often they needed to run for the nearest chamber. Pot for prostitutes. Diet wasn't a matter of choice. It was dictated by what was available, cheap, or offered by clients. And that diet carried consequences. You picture yourself hunched over a steaming bowl of pottage, the standard medieval dish. Mainstream historical fact: pottage was a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and occasionally meat, eaten daily by rich and poor alike. It was filling, but it wasn't exactly gentle on the digestive system. Imagine eating variations of the same mush day after day, the onions and leeks lingering on your breath, the cabbage fermenting in your gut. For prostitutes who worked in close quarters and relied on their bodies to attract, the after effects of diet became part of the daily struggle. Quirky tidbit: medieval cookbooks recommended adding spices like cinnamon, cloves, or pepper to cover up the stronger flavors of meat, gone slightly off. But spices were expensive, so most people, especially prostitutes, rarely had access. Instead, they ate what they could get stew thickened with barley, salted herring, hard cheese, and black bread dense enough to double as a weapon. Your jaw aches just imagining chewing through it. And while nobles dined on venison and sugared almonds, prostitutes gnawed through scraps, their teeth grinding against gritty flour full of tiny stone particles. You glance at the drinking vessels, lined up on a shelf. Water was risky, as you've already seen. Ale and beer were the safer options, brewed weak but drunk constantly. They quenched thirst, replaced lost calories, and dulled the sharper edges of hunger. But they also left breath sour, skin flushed, and bladders overworked. Imagine the awkwardness of slipping away from a client mid-encounter because the ale had gone straight through you. Hygiene wasn't just about baths and perfumes. It was about how diet twisted the body's rhythms. Historians still argue whether medieval diets were healthier in some respects than modern ones. On one hand, they were heavy in fiber, whole grains, and vegetables. On the other, the constant lack of variety and the risk of food spoilage caused nutritional imbalances and sickness. For prostitutes, the consequences were immediate: a bloated stomach, bad breath, or skin eruptions linked to poor diet. None of these were easy to disguise with powder or perfume. You step into the kitchen of a brothel, where a woman stirs a pot over a smoky hearth. The stew smells hearty, but also pungent garlic, onions, and salted fish. The smoke burns your eyes, and you cough. This was the daily environment. Kitchens full of haze, food stored without refrigeration, meat hung in smoky rafters. A prostitute might eat quickly between clients, gulping down a slice of bread dipped in stew, then rush back to work with onion breath she couldn't mask. Perfume and herbs helped, but they couldn't erase the dietary realities of the time. Quirky aside, some medieval people believed that eating certain foods influenced bodily odors. Garlic and onions were notorious for making sweat smell stronger. Wine could heat the humors, causing flushed cheeks and sweaty palms. One bizarre belief claimed that eating beets could make your breath smell sweet, though it's doubtful anyone leaned in close enough to test. Prostitutes, aware of these associations, might avoid some foods before working if they had the luxury of choice. More often, hunger trumped reputation. You sit at the table now, chewing a hunk of rye bread so dense it feels like chewing bark. Crumbs scatter into your lap, and your teeth ache from the grind. You imagine a prostitute sharing this same meal, then leaning close to a client minutes later, hoping her charm outweighed the lingering taste of sour bread and cheap ale. Hunger was stronger than hygiene. Historians still argue whether prostitutes had better diets than ordinary women. Some suggest yes, since clients occasionally bought them meals or drinks. Others insist no, pointing to evidence of poverty and malnutrition among sex workers. Likely, their diets oscillated wildly lavish when a wealthy client was generous, meager when times were lean. The inconsistency itself added stress to their bodies. You think, too, of digestion. Without modern plumbing, every meal eventually led to chamber pots or outhouses, both overflowing and rarely cleaned. For prostitutes, this meant more than inconvenience. It meant living in an environment where waste was ever present, odors clung, and privacy was rare. Imagine trying to maintain a lure when your stomach groaned from poorly cooked beans, or your chamber pot stood only feet from your bed. Hygiene wasn't just a surface problem, it started deep inside the body. Quirky tidbit again. One medieval remedy for bad breath suggested chewing fennel seeds mixed with honey. Another proposed holding a clove in the mouth. Both might have worked briefly, but cloves were expensive and honey was sticky. Picture the comedy of leaning in for a kiss, while your teeth are glued together with candied fennel. Not exactly the smoothest move. You walk out of the kitchen now, the smells of stew, smoke, and ale clinging to your clothes. The city hums with the sounds of taverns, laughter, and flatulence because, yes, the medieval diet was notoriously gassy. In a world without deodorant or plumbing, that meant odors followed you everywhere. For prostitutes, there was no escaping it. They had to laugh it off, play through, and keep the illusion alive. And maybe you chuckle to yourself, realizing that even today, after a heavy garlic dinner or a few too many beers, people reach for breath mints and cologne to patch the damage. The medieval world didn't invent the struggle between diet and desirability, just played the game with far fewer tools. You leave the smoky kitchens and the stew-filled air behind, but the conversation in your head keeps circling back to what happens after the meals, the perfumes, and the powder. Because the true nightmare of hygiene for medieval prostitutes wasn't just about dirt or bad breath, was about disease. Step carefully down these narrow alleys, and you'll see why. Behind shuttered doors and candlelit brothel chambers, the risks of infection lingered in every touch, every kiss, every whispered promise. Mainstream historical fact: sexually transmitted infections were present in medieval Europe, though their forms and names differed from what we recognize today. Some chroniclers describe the burning sickness, others note sores, rashes, or fevers spreading through brothels. By the late 15th century, syphilis erupted across Europe, devastating populations and earning nicknames like the French disease or the Neapolitan disease, depending on who was doing the blaming. But even before syphilis became infamous, gonorrhea and other infections quietly spread. Imagine living in a world where your body is your livelihood, but your livelihood constantly threatens to betray you with pain and disfigurement. You step into a physician's chamber. He wears a long robe and a strange cap, his hands stained from grinding herbs. On his table sit jars of ointments, mercury salves, vinegar concoctions, and herbal poultices. A prostitute might come here seeking relief from sores or burning sensations, but the treatments are as dangerous as the illnesses. Mercury ointments, for example, could cause tremors, hallucinations, and even death. Imagine rubbing a toxic paste into your skin, praying it would heal you, while it quietly poisoned your body. Historians still argue whether prostitutes sought medical help regularly or avoided it out of fear and stigma. Some records suggest that city officials forced brothels to undergo health inspections. But whether those inspections truly helped is another debate. Altogether, you lean closer to hear the physician mutter, "Purge the humors." In medieval medicine, disease wasn't about germs. It was about imbalanced, too much black bile, too much phlegm, too much heat. So the cures involved bloodletting, cupping, or purging with laxatives. Imagine already being weak from infection, then being bled until you nearly faint. For prostitutes, this was often the reality, remedies that drained them of strength rather than restoring it. Quirky tidbit: some believed that tying a live toad to the thigh could cure venereal disease, drawing the sickness into the animal. Others swore by mixtures of wine, garlic, and ground-up gemstones. Picture a prostitute sitting in her chamber with a squirming toad strapped to her leg, muttering, "Well, at least it's cheaper than mercury." You can't help but laugh, even as you wince at the desperation behind it. You walk back into the brothel dormitory, where several women lie restless on straw pallets. One coughs violently, her face pale with fever. Another scratches at sores on her arms, trying to hide them under her sleeve. Disease wasn't just sexual, it was environmental. Tuberculosis, typhus, and skin infections ran rampant in close quarters. Without proper hygiene, even a small cut could fester into a life-threatening wound. Prostitutes, constantly exposed to multiple clients, lived at the intersection of every possible infection route. Their bodies weren't just judge, they were battlegrounds. You pause by a window, listening to the city outside. Bells toll for the sick, priests chant prayers for protection against plague. Historians still argue whether prostitution played a significant role in spreading the Black Death. But the reality is simpler. When everyone lives in filth, everyone is vulnerable. Still, Prostitutes bore extra stigma. When illness spread, people pointed fingers at them, calling them the source, the unclean ones. Yet those same accusers often lined up at their doors when night fell. The hypocrisy drips heavier than the candle wax. Step into a tavern now, where men drink and joke. You hear one brag about avoiding disease by sleeping only with younger prostitutes, believing their youth protected them. Another claims that a prayer to Saint Roch keeps him safe. The myths pile high, and prostitutes must navigate them all. Some clients refuse to use women rumored to be sick. Others didn't care, convinced of their own immunity. For prostitutes, this meant income fluctuated based on rumor and reputation. A cough, a rash, a whisper knee could destroy their ability to earn. Quirky aside, one city ordinance in Nuremberg required prostitutes to undergo regular medical checks, but the inspections were laughably inadequate. A town official might simply glance at a woman's face and declare her fit. Imagine trusting your health to a 10-second look from a man more concerned about paperwork than disease. Yet those inspections became part of the record, shaping how authorities claimed to manage prostitution while ignoring the actual risks. You picture the smell of infection, now the sweet, sickly odor of untreated wounds, the acrid tang of mercury ointment, the sourness of fever sweat. In a candlelit room, perfumes tried to cover it, but the underlying scent lingered. Imagine lying down beside someone, trying to ignore not only your own pain, but also the awareness that tomorrow might be worse. Hygiene here wasn't just about washing or combing. It was about fighting an invisible enemy with the flimsiest of weapons. Historians still argue whether prostitutes developed their own informal networks of health knowledge. Some suggest they shared herbal remedies, sage teas, garlic poultices, vinegar rinses passed down through experience. Others think the lack of surviving records simply erases their contributions. But it's easy to imagine women quietly teaching each other. Chew this for the pain, rub that for the sores. In a world where official medicine often failed them, shared wisdom might have been the only true relief. You step outside once more, breathing deeply, though the air itself isn't safe. The night is alive, with risk fleas carrying plague, rats scuttling in shadows, people coughing into sleeves. Prostitutes walked this world every night, balancing allure and danger, earning coins while risking their very survival. For them, disease wasn't an occasional fear, it was a constant companion, sitting silently in every exchange, every shared breath. And as you rub your arms, imagining the crawling of fever, you realize this: the nightmare of hygiene for prostitutes wasn't just about dirt or stink. It was about the precarious line between livelihood and death, traced across their very bodies. You linger now near the echoing stone walls of a church, the tolling of bells cutting through the night air, and you sense another layer to the nightmare of Hygiene morality, religion, and public shaming tangled with the simple act of staying clean. Because in medieval Europe, dirt wasn't just dirt. It was often interpreted as a sign of sin, impurity, or divine punishment. For prostitutes, who already bore society's moral condemnation, hygiene became more than a physical struggle. It became a stage on which virtue and vice were argued over, sermon by sermon. Step inside the church, and the air shifts immediately. Incense swirls, covering the musk of sweat and damp cloaks. Candles flicker, casting shadows on carved saints. The priest at the pulpit raises his voice, condemning lust, vanity, and the corruption of the flesh. Mainstream historical fact. The medieval church often linked physical cleanliness with spiritual purity or lack thereof. Bathhouses, once tolerated, were increasingly labeled as dens of sin, and prostitutes, naturally, were lumped into that judgment. A woman who spent too much time washing might be accused of tempting men. Yet a woman who appeared too dirty was accused of being immoral by neglect. You see the trap, don't you? Damned if you washed, damned if you didn't. Glance around the pews. Housewives nod solemnly, merchants cross themselves, children fidget, and sitting in the shadows at the back, prostitutes bow their heads, knowing full well these sermons are aimed partly at them. It's not just about sin, it's about control. Public shaming reinforced the idea that their bodies, already heavily policed by law, were also the battleground of morality. Historians still argue whether such sermons genuinely changed behavior, or whether they simply fueled gossip and stigma. But for prostitutes, the impact was real. Every cough, every stain on clothing, every whiff of body odor could be used as evidence of their sinfulness. Quirky tidbit: in some towns, prostitutes were forced to participate in public penance rituals. Imagine being paraded through the streets in nothing but a shift, sometimes carrying candles or wearing signs proclaiming your sin. Crowds jeered, children threw refuse, neighbors turned their faces away. And while the ritual was about moral cleansing, no one stopped to think about the lice crawling in the woman's hair or the sores on her skin. Hygiene was weaponized as morality theater. Step outside the church again, and you see a different kind of cleansing. Holy water, basins at the entrance. People dip their fingers, cross themselves, and believe they've symbolically washed away sin. For prostitutes, such rituals offered little comfort. If they were seen touching the water, some might mutter that it was polluted by their touch. The irony is stark. The very water meant to sanctify could also be used to stigmatize. You walk now to the town square, where a preacher stands on a wooden platform, shouting about the dangers of lust. He points toward the brothel district, claiming that unwashed women spread disease and drag men's souls to hell. The crowd murmurs in agreement. Yet you notice a handful of those same men drifting toward the brothels as the sermon ends, coins jangling in their pouches. Hypocrisy runs thick in the air, as pungent as the smell of dung on the cobblestones. Historians still argue whether church influence genuinely reduced prostitution or simply pushed it into darker corners. Some cities even operated municipal brothels under the guise of regulation, collecting taxes while publicly condemning the trade. The contradiction is almost comical. Sermons thundered against unclean women, while town officials counted the revenue from their work. For prostitutes, this double standard meant constant vigilance. They had to appear modest enough not to scandalize, but alluring enough to survive. You pause by a stone fountain where a few women draw water. A prostitute approaches, but the matrons glare and block her way. She waits silently, clutching her bucket, humiliated. This scene played out countless times. Hygiene resources rationed not by scarcity alone, but by morality. The message was clear: clean water was for respectable women, while prostitutes were left to fend for themselves. Imagine the frustration, the humiliation of being denied even the chance to rinse your hands because your profession branded you unworthy. Quirky aside, in some places, prostitutes were required to wear bells or clappers when walking the streets, much like lepers. The idea was to warn respectable citizens of their approach. Picture the absurdity: women jingling as they moved, trying to lure clients while simultaneously being marked as dangerous. It turned their very bodies into public spectacles, where hygiene and morality blurred into humiliation. You walk into the brothel district again, but now you notice how sermons echo here too. Some prostitutes whisper prayers before starting their work, clutching rosaries or kissing small crosses. Others pin sprigs of herbs to their clothing, believing them to be protective charms against disease and sin. Historians still argue whether these gestures were true acts of faith or desperate performances of piety to deflect judgment. Perhaps they were both moments of genuine hope woven into the fabric of survival. You lean against a doorway as the night grows colder, reflecting on how morality layered over hygiene. For prostitutes, staying clean wasn't just about water, soap, or powder. It was about dodging accusations, surviving public shaming, and navigating rules that contradicted themselves at every turn. If they smelled, they were judged. If they wore perfume, they were judged. If they washed too often, they were judged. If they didn't wash, they were judged. You can almost laugh at the futility of it, though the reality is heartbreaking. The bells toll again in the distance, announcing another sermon tomorrow. And you realize this. The filth clinging to prostitutes wasn't just physical, it was social, moral, and symbolic. No powder could mask it, no perfume could wash it away. They carried not just the grime of the streets, but the weight of society's hypocrisy on their shoulders. And perhaps you whisper to yourself, with a touch of sarcasm, so much for cleanliness being next to godliness. For medieval prostitutes, it seemed cleanliness was next to impossible. You step away from the echo of the church bells and wander toward the crooked stalls of an apothecary street. The smells here are stranger than the incense in the cathedral: sharp vinegar, drying herbs, and something faintly animal. This is where the world of quirky cures and bizarre remedies collides with the daily struggle to keep bodies alive. Because when hygiene and medicine fail, people turn to desperate measures. And for prostitutes, whose health and appearance meant survival, every potion and every charm, no matter how odd, carried a glimmer of hope. The first stall you pass belongs to an herbalist. She has bundles of sage, rosemary, and thyme hanging in fragrant clusters. She offers a small bag of crushed mint for a few coins, promising it will sweeten your breath and banish sickness. Mainstream historical fact: herbal remedies were the foundation of medieval medicine. Physicians studied humoral theory in universities. But everyday people, especially women, relied on herbs grown in gardens and sold in markets. Prostitutes, often excluded from elite medical care, turned to these grassroots remedies: a rinse of sage tea for a sore throat, a compress of chamomile for irritated skin, or a bundle of lavender tied to a bedpost to keep pests away. These were their pharmacies. But then the oddities appear. You move to the next stall and see jars labeled with symbols: powdered stag's horn, dried snakeskins, crocodile dung. Quirky tidbit. Crocodile dung was genuinely recommended in some texts as a contraceptive, used either as a pessary or mixed into pastes. Imagine the grim comedy of applying animal waste as a supposed barrier against pregnancy, all while convincing yourself it would work. You almost laugh, but then you remember the stakes. Pregnancy could mean the end of income, the risk of abandonment, or worse. Desperation makes even the strangest remedies seem reasonable. You pause to watch a woman stirring a bowl of pigeon droppings with vinegar. The mixture smells as foul as it looks, yet she claims it brightens the skin. Prostitutes might have dabbed such concoctions on their cheeks, hoping to mask blemishes or sores. Historians still argue whether these remedies were widespread or exaggerated in later accounts meant to mock women, but the archaeological traces, vials, notes, and references in medical texts suggest that strange substances truly circulated in daily practice. Inside a dim shop, you find an apothecary grinding minerals with a mortar and pestle. He sprinkles a little powdered pearl into a jar of honey. Good for the heart, he declares. Powdered gems were believed to carry healing properties, though the poor rarely afforded them. A prostitute might glimpse such luxury only if a wealthy client paid for it. More often, she was left with vinegar rinses, herbal teas, or charms. Quirky aside, some believed that wearing a dried frog in a pouch around your neck could protect against plague or venereal disease. Picture a prostitute tying a small pouch to her belt, the frog rattling inside as she walks, and convincing herself that it might keep sickness at bay. Superstition filled the gaps where science faltered. You walk out into the street again and notice women selling amulets, tiny crosses, beads, or written prayers folded into leather cases. These weren't just spiritual tokens. They were considered protective hygiene. If disease came through air or demons, then a holy charm was as effective as soap. Prostitutes, often balancing religious guilt with survival needs, might wear a rosary by day and an amulet by night, covering both bases. Historians still argue whether such objects were genuinely believed to heal or whether they served more as psychological comfort. Either way, they were part of the hygiene struggle, invisible shields against an invisible world. Step further along, and you find a barber surgeon setting up shop. He sharpens his knives, ready to bleed a customer. Bloodletting was a cure. Much heat in the body, bleed it out. Fever, bleed it out. Skin sores, bleed it out. Prostitutes, too, sometimes submitted to these treatments. Imagine, already weak from poor diet, sitting in a smoky room while a man drains a cup of blood from your arm, insisting it will balance your humors. Hygiene, in this case, became not just about filth but about deliberate wounding in the name of health. You hear gossip about other odd remedies. Some people believed rubbing garlic on the soles of the feet could draw sickness out. Others swore by smearing butter mixed with crushed worms onto sores. Quirky tidbit again. Medieval texts sometimes recommended wearing roasted onions in your armpits to drive away plague. Imagine stepping into a brothel, the air thick with perfume, while someone reeks faintly of cooked onions hidden under her dress. Clients might laugh, or they might convince themselves it smelled like protection. You stop at a tavern table where women share stories of remedies. One swears by vinegar baths. Another insists that rubbing ashes into her skin keeps lice away. A third mutters about a traveling peddler who sold her a potion guaranteed to preserve beauty. She admits it burned her lips, but she still uses it, because what choice does she have? You realize these conversations were probably constant in brothel quarters, women comparing notes, passing along tricks, and sometimes mocking the ridiculousness of it all. Historians still argue whether prostitutes were more experimental with remedies than the general population. Some suggest their constant exposure to clients, diseases, and social stigma forced them to try anything. Others argue that remedies were universal. Everyone, from peasants to nobles, tried equally strange cures. But in the lives of prostitutes, the stakes were sharper. Appearance, health, and income balanced on the success of each remedy. The night deepens, and the apothecary's stalls close. The smells of herbs and dung fade into the background, leaving you with the memory of desperate ingenuity. Hygiene in medieval prostitution wasn't just about washing, it was about inventing defenses against the impossible, about strapping frogs to thighs and dabbing vinegar-soaked pigeon droppings on cheeks, about wearing charms that jingled while you worked. And maybe, as you walk away, you shake your head with a smile, because even today, people chase miracle cures, detox, teas, crystals, and fad diets. The difference is that modern gimmicks rarely involve crocodile dung. The medieval world may seem absurd, but the desperation behind those remedies feels uncomfortably familiar. You leave the apothecary street behind and wander toward the city gates, where travelers, soldiers, and pilgrims shuffle in and out, their boots caked with mud, their cloaks stiff with rain and sweat. Here, the hygiene story of prostitutes takes on a wider dimension, because their lives were never isolated. They intersected constantly with outsiders, mercenaries on leave, merchants passing through, pilgrims stopping on their way to holy shrines. And wherever people moved, so did grime, smells, and diseases. The mixing of bodies in this world was as much about shared dirt as shared desire. Picture yourself standing near the gatehouse. A group of soldiers clatters past, their armor dented, their faces blackened with soot from the battlefield. Mainstream historical fact: armies in the Middle Ages were notoriously unhygienic. Campaigns meant long marches without access to clean water, sleeping in tents or barns, and rarely changing clothes. Soldiers often carried lice, fleas, and dysentery with them, leaving trails of sickness in their wake. When they reached towns, prostitutes were among the first to interact with them, both socially and intimately. That meant prostitutes bore the brunt of infections and infestations imported from distant battlefields. You watch one soldier remove his helmet, revealing greasy hair matted with sweat. He scratches his beard, and you can almost feel the lice crawling. Quirky tidbit: some soldiers shaved their heads entirely to fight lice, but most didn't bother. Instead, they scratched and joked about their companions. Prostitutes had no choice but to accept these clients, leaning close despite the stink of leather soaked with months of sweat. Imagine the courage it took to smile and flatter under those conditions. Pilgrims were another group you see passing by. They wear simple cloaks, carry walking sticks, and display badges from holy sites. Their feet are blistered, their clothes unwashed after weeks on the road. Yet they, too, sometimes sought out prostitutes, despite their religious vows. Historians still argue whether pilgrim hostels tolerated or quietly ignored such encounters. But records suggest it happened often enough to provoke sermons condemning it. For prostitutes, pilgrims represented both opportunity and risk. A pilgrim might pay generously, grateful for comfort after hardship, but he might also bring bedbugs, rashes, or intestinal infections from far-off lands. You turn toward the stables, where merchants unload wagons heavy with goods. Their journeys have been long, their bodies unwashed, their hands sticky from days of handling leather reins. Prostitutes often mingled with such men too, lured by the chance of extra coin. Yet with them came exotic illnesses, spoiled food, and odors of livestock. Quirky aside, some merchants believed rubbing garlic on their skin kept away disease, so they smelled perpetually pungent. Imagine negotiating intimacy through a wall of garlic sweat. Romantic, isn't it? The mingling of all these groups made brothels hubs not just of commerce but of contagion. Step into one now, and you hear the clash of dialects, the mix of accents from far-off towns. Soldiers laugh loudly, pilgrims whisper prayers, merchants haggle over coin. Prostitutes move among them, adapting speech and gestures to each client, while silently bracing for the hygiene challenges each encounter brings. The straw mattresses grow heavier with shared grime, the chamber pots fill faster, and the air thickens with the collective odors of the road. Historians still argue whether towns tried to regulate these interactions to prevent outbreaks. Some cities issued ordinances limiting soldiers' access to brothels, especially during wartime, but enforcement was inconsistent. After all, soldiers had money to spend, and authorities liked the revenue. Prostitutes, meanwhile, had no say. They simply endured the revolving door of dirty boots and foreign germs. You step back into the street, watching a pilgrim remove his shoes. His feet are cracked, bleeding, and raw. He winces as he walks barefoot to a fountain, washing them in the same basin where children drink. Imagine the bacteria blooming in that water, carried into brothels hours later. Hygiene wasn't just personal, it was communal, and one person's dirt became everyone's burden. Quirky tidbit again. Travelers often carried charms or tokens against disease. Soldiers wore amulets inscribed with prayers. Pilgrims carried shells from Santiago de Compostela. Prostitutes sometimes received these trinkets as gifts, tucking them into bodices or hanging them from belts. Whether they believed in their power or not, the charms became part of their lives, mingling superstition with survival. You step into an inn now, its floor sticky with spilled ale. Travelers crowd the benches, eating greasy meat pies, sharing mugs, coughing into the air. Prostitutes work here too, weaving between tables, smiling despite the haze of smoke and stink. They laugh at jokes, sip from mugs passed around, and hope that whatever illness lurks in the ale foam doesn't strike them tomorrow. Hygiene in this world was about risk management. You couldn't avoid filth, but you could hope to dodge its worst effects. Historians still argue whether these encounters made prostitutes key vectors of disease, or whether that was simply scapegoating by moralists. Certainly, they were vulnerable, exposed to clients from every corner of society. But so too were tavern keepers, inn servants, and laundresses. Yet the stigma stuck to prostitutes most heavily, reinforcing their association with dirt and contagion. As night deepens, you hear the clatter of dice from a soldier's game. The murmurs of a pilgrim's prayer, the laughter of merchants counting profits. Prostitutes hover at the edges, waiting, watching, adapting. They are survivalists in the truest sense, navigating a world where hygiene isn't just a nightmare, it's a roulette wheel spun with every new client. You step back into the cool air, shaking your head at the impossible contradictions. Soldiers carried lice, pilgrims carried rashes, merchants carried garlic, sweat-tanned prostitutes carried the blame. You can almost laugh at the absurdity, though the reality is grim. And perhaps, as you wander away, you mutter, "At least travelers today bring hotel soaps instead of fleas." The medieval world had no such courtesy baskets, just mud, bugs, and the endless sharing of grime. You wander farther into the heart of the city, where the lanes twist tightly, and every corner brings a fresh assault on your senses. Here, the issue is no longer just individual soldiers, pilgrims, or merchants, but the city itself, urban. Life in the Middle Ages was one long sensory overload, and smells defined it more than sights or sounds. For prostitutes who lived and worked in these quarters, the overwhelming cocktail of odors wasn't simply background, it was the atmosphere they had to breathe, sell, and survive. In step into a narrow street, and the first thing that hits you is refuse. Buckets of waste dumped from windows streak down the walls, leaving greasy stains. Mainstream historical fact. Many medieval towns had ordinances about when households could empty chamber pots into the street. Some required cries of warning, "Gardaloo," in parts of Scotland, or "Watch out" elsewhere before waste splashed into the gutters. But rules rarely stopped the reality. Imagine dodging buckets of filth while trying to appear enticing to a client. Prostitutes had to navigate these streets nightly, their shoes and skirts soaking up whatever clung to the cobbles. The second layer is animals. Pigs root in heaps of trash, chickens scuttle underfoot, and horses clop by, leaving steaming piles behind. The smell of manure blends seamlessly with that of human waste. Quirky tidbit: some cities actually licensed pigs as street cleaners, believing their rooting helped clear refuse. Picture the irony: a prostitute dodging filth while a pig, meant to be cleaning, only spreads it around. Add a summer sun beating down, and the stench multiplies into something eye-watering. You step closer to a butcher's stall. Carcasses hang from hooks, dripping blood onto the ground. Flies swarm, buzzing around cuts of meat. The butcher wipes his hands on a dirty apron, then tosses offal into the gutter. Prostitutes pass these stalls daily, sometimes even renting rooms above them. Imagine trying to greet a client upstairs, while below, the smell of rotting intestines fills the stairwell. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly didn't notice the smells after living in them constantly, or whether they simply learned to endure them. For prostitutes, endurance wasn't optionally, was the very air of their work. Turn down another lane, and the tanner's quarter makes the butcher's stall seem mild. Hides soak in vats of urine, used to soften leather. Workers stomp barefoot in the liquid, splashing it over the cobbles. The stink clings to your nose, sour and sharp. Prostitutes, unlucky enough to live nearby, had to contend with this daily, their clothes absorbing the reek. No perfume could fully mask it. Quirky aside, one medieval text joked that you could smell a tanner before you saw him. Imagine the same being said of prostitutes forced to breathe the same air smells, becoming not just accidents but social branding. And then there is smoke. Nearly every household burns wood or peat for heat and cooking. The air grows heavy with soot staining walls, stinging eyes. Prostitutes, often working in cramped rooms with little ventilation, inhaled this constantly. Their lungs filled with particulates, their hair and clothes soaked in smoke. Some tried to mask the smell by hanging herbs in rafters or burning incense, but the baseline never disappeared. Even laughter at a brothel table carried the tang of wood smoke. Step into a market square, and the layers of smell collide: fishmongers with barrels of herring, bakers with scorched bread, ale brewers with yeasty vats. Add sweating bodies, unwashed, for days, and you have the medieval scentscape. Prostitutes had to carve their identities within this chaos, trying to appear desirable, even as odors clung from every angle. Imagine applying rosewater while the neighbor fries onions and dumps the grease into the street. Your perfume doesn't disappear, it just joins the mix. Historians still argue whether medieval people associated bad smells with disease. Some point to the theory of miasma, bad air believed to cause illness, as proof that they did. Others argue that while people noticed odors, they didn't connect them to contagion as we do. For prostitutes, the debate didn't matter. Smell meant judgment. A foul-smelling street marked them as filthy. A perfumed scarf offered only temporary reprieve. Quirky tidbit again. Some wealthier townsfolk carried pomander spheres filled with cloves, cinnamon, or musk to sniff when the air turned unbearable. Prostitutes, with fewer resources, sometimes stuffed herbs in their sleeves or bodices. Picture a woman lifting her arm subtly, mid-conversation, sniffing the lavender tucked inside, trying to momentarily escape the stench. It's a tiny act of defiance in a world where foul air ruled. You sit now on a bench in the square, trying to breathe through your mouth, but even that fails. The taste of the city clings to your tongues: smoke, dung, fish, sweat. Imagine kissing someone in this world. There's no such thing as fresh breath, only less offensive breath. And yet, intimacy carried on. Desire persisted. Prostitutes had to laugh, flirt, and lean close, all while surrounded by smells that would send a modern nose reeling. Night falls, but the smells don't fade. Instead, new ones join in. Torches drip pitch, filling the air with tar. Alehouses spill drunken men into the streets, their vomit splashing onto cobblestones. Prostitutes step around puddles, steadying men too far gone to walk, guiding them back inside. The odor of alcohol sweat mixes with the earlier stew of dung and smoke. Hygiene isn't just about washing anymore, it's about surviving a sensory assault every hour of the day. Historians still argue whether cities were truly as foul as described in chroniclers' exaggerated complaints, or whether moralists emphasized dirt to shame urban life. But even if accounts were dramatized, the archaeological layers cesspits overflowing, bones from butcher's waste, residues of smoke, prove the smells were real enough. For prostitutes, they weren't metaphors. They were the environment in which business was conducted, hour after hour. You lean back, eyes closed, trying to imagine the daily resilience required to laugh, to charm, to attract, while breathing air filled with decay. to walk streets where your hem dragged through waste, to wash your face in water already clouded with someone else's filth, and to know that every smell, every stain, every cough would be held against you as proof of your unclean life. Perhaps you chuckle softly now, realizing that even today, cities have their smells: subway grime, hot garbage, fast food grease. The medieval city just dialed it up to 11. But for prostitutes, it wasn't just unpleasant. It was the constant backdrop to survival, shaping how they lived, how they were judged, and how they endured. You walk away from the bathhouse ruins and follow the sound of splashing. At the edge of town, a line of women bends over the riverbank, their skirts hitched up, their hands raw and red from the cold. These are the laundresses, the water bearers, the cleaners, whose work never ends. And here lies another piece of the hygiene puzzle for prostitutes: the endless labor of women with buckets, basins, and scrubbed knuckles, shaping how clothes and bodies looked or failed to look clean. You crouch beside a laundress, beating a shirt against a rock. Each slap echoes across the water. Mainstream historical fact: washing clothing in the Middle Ages was women's work, done by hand, with harsh lye soap, or simply with ash and water. Laundresses gathered at rivers, fountains, or communal washhouses, scrubbing until their arms ached. Prostitutes relied heavily on these services when they could afford them, because clothing bright stripes, chemises, scarves, was central to their identity. A clean chemise, even if only briefly freshened, could mean the difference between attracting a client and being turned away. But here's the problem: the water itself was often filthy. Tanners upstream dumped vats of urine and lime. Butchers threw animal guts into the river. Housewives emptied slop buckets into the current. By the time laundresses soaked garments downstream, they were rinsing them in liquid already crawling with bacteria. Imagine your clean shift coming out smelling faintly of fish guts or urine. For prostitutes, using it as a natural abrasive. Others used fuller's earth, a clay that absorbed oils. Picture your chemise scoured with sand until the fabric thinned, holes appearing long before the stains disappeared. Prostitutes often patched and repatched their clothes, not just from wear, but from the damage of overscrubbing. Cleanliness literally tore fabric apart. You watch as another laundress wrings out a chemise, twisting it until water streams down her arms. She laughs with her companions, gossiping about who wore what, who stained their shift with wine, who reeked of garlic. Laundresses were the keepers of secrets. They handled the intimate garments of prostitutes, and in doing so, they gathered stories, rumors, and judgments. Historians still argue whether laundresses were allies or enemies to prostitutes, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes mocking. Either way, they were unavoidable. Prostitutes often washed small items themselves: scarves, stockings, handkerchiefs, while leaving larger linens to laundresses. But the cycle was endless: wash, wear, soil, wash again. And every time, the water grew murkier, the fabric weaker. Imagine putting on a shift that still smelled faintly sour, despite yesterday's wash. You'd dab rose water at the neckline and hope the client didn't notice. Historians still argue whether prostitutes had access to better laundry resources through brothel keepers. Some suggest that licensed brothels supplied clean sheets regularly as part of city regulation. Others point out that clean was a relative term, maybe a shake of straw, a rinse in river water, and the same sheet returned to the bed. Archaeological digs of brothel sites show heavy infestations of lice and fleas in bedding remains, proving that linen changes were neither frequent nor effective. Quirky aside, some women used urine as a cleaning agent because its ammonia content helped whiten fabrics. Collecting urine was a recognized trade. Pots were set out to gather it. Imagine prostitutes handing over their chemises to be washed in vats of stale urine, then putting them back on with forced smiles. You almost laugh at the absurdity. But again, the alternatives were few. You watch laundresses hauling baskets of wet linen back into town. The fabric drips onto cobblestones, picking up new dirt before it's even dry. In brothels, sheets are hung near smoky hearths, absorbing soot as they dry. Cleanliness becomes not an end state, but a moving target, temporary, fragile, always undermined by the world around it. Step into a small chamber where a prostitute scrubs her shift herself. Her hands are red, her knuckles raw, her back bent. She mutters about the cost of hiring a laundress. Soap is precious, so she rubs ash into the fabric, rinses it in a bucket, wrings it until her arms ache. She hangs it by the hearth, watching smoke curl into the damp cloth. Tomorrow she'll wear it again, a little less stained, a little more threadbare. This is hygiene at its most practical, painful work. Minimal results, endless repetition. Historians still argue whether medieval women viewed laundry as hygiene or simply as household maintenance. Some claim it was explicitly about cleanliness. Others insist it was about appearances. For prostitutes, it was both. Clean linen wasn't just fabric, it was part of their bodies, part of the illusion they sold. A bright scarf, freshly rinsed, might convince a client of freshness, even if the woman herself hadn't washed in days. Quirky tidbit again. Some brothels reportedly fined women for wearing visibly dirty clothing because it reflected poorly on the establishment. Enforcement likely varied, but the idea is telling. Cleanliness, or at least the performance of it, was regulated even in spaces dedicated to vice. Prostitutes had to invest time and effort in laundry, not because it made them healthier, but because it made them marketable. As you step back outside, you notice the river glinting in the moonlight. It looks peaceful now, but you know it carries layers of waste, secrets, and compromises. Prostitutes walked that line daily between filth and illusion, between labor and survival, garments that bore witness to their lives. And maybe you sigh softly, realizing that even today, laundry feels endless. But at least modern washers don't soak your favorite shirt in urine. The medieval laundressand, the prostitute who relied on her wood filled for a spin cycle. You leave the market square behind, but the question lingers in your mind like a stubborn odor. Did medieval people really give up bathing altogether? You've heard the stereotype before the Middle Ages as 1,000 years of dirt, everyone refusing to touch water. But as you walk down a lane toward the remnants of an old bathhouse, you realize the truth is messier, layered with debates that continue even among scholars today. For prostitutes, this uncertainty about bathing wasn't just academic, it shaped their reputations, their routines, and the very illusions they tried to maintain. Step inside the crumbling bathhouse. The tubs stand empty, cracked from neglect. Dust drifts where once steam swirled. Mainstream historical fact: many bathhouses closed after outbreaks of plague in the 14th century because people believed hot water opened pores, making the body vulnerable to disease. Yet other records show that private bathing continued in homes, with basins, sponges, and even small tubs. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly abandoned bathing en masse, or whether they simply shifted from communal baths to more private, modest washing rituals. You picture a prostitute in this transitional period. If the bathhouse is open, she might sneak in at dawn, hoping to wash before clients arrive, risking gossip about her presence. If the bathhouse is closed, she might settle for heating water in a small pot, filling a wooden basin, and washing just her face, hands, and underarms. Partial washing, sometimes called dry bathing, was common. Perfumes and powders filled the gaps, but the rumors about full bathing, whether too risky or too vain, always hovered. Quirky tidbit: some medieval manuals advised people to bathe only once a month in winter and twice a month in summer. Imagine being a prostitute trying to sell a lure. With that schedule, the advice may not have been universal, but it reflects how bathing was tangled with suspicion. To clean, and you might be mocked for vanity or immorality. Too dirty, and you risked losing clients. It was a no-win game. You kneel beside one of the cracked tubs, imagining it filled with steaming water. Soap, if used, would have been made from animal fat and lye harsh, drying and smelly. Linen cloths served as sponges, dipped in the water, rubbed across skin. For prostitutes, even this rough method offered temporary relief from grime. But without modern drains, the dirty water had to be dumped somewhere, often right back into the street. You see the cycle now. Wash away filth, only to recycle it into the same environment that bred it. Historians still argue whether people in certain regions, Sicily, for example, maintained higher bathing standards than others. In southern climates, public baths survived longer, tied to Roman traditions. In northern cities, suspicion grew quicker, leading to bans. Prostitutes, moving through these spaces, had to adapt to local norms. A woman in Florence might have had more access to baths than one in London, and her hygiene reputation would reflect that difference. Geography mattered as much as poverty. Step outside the bathhouse ruins, and you hear neighbors gossiping. One mutters that only sinners wash so much. Another says, better to smell of herbs than risk the plague. For prostitutes, these whispers had weight. Even if they wanted to wash, they risked being branded immoral. And if they didn't wash, they risked being called filthy. Society built a paradox around them, and they carried it on their skin. Quirky aside, some people practiced sweat bathing, instead sitting in small wooden huts filled with steam, then scraping sweat off with curved tools called stritch. Imagine prostitutes trying this method, their bodies glistening in steam, scraping off layers of grime, only to step back into a street full of refuse. Clean for a moment, dirty again in an instant. The illusion of hygiene was fleeting, always, undermined by the city outside. You stop at a fountain where women fill buckets. One discreetly washes her face, splashing quickly before others scold her for vanity. This captures the debate perfectly. People wanted to be clean, but social norms and fears shaped how far they could go. Prostitutes lived in that tension, constantly. Their profession demanded cleanliness, yet their society distrusted it. Historians still argue whether medieval Europeans smelled worse than people in later centuries. Some say yes, pointing to the decline of bathhouses. Others argue that 16th and 17th century populations, when bathing declined even further, were actually either way. For prostitutes, the debate doesn't erase the reality. They fought daily for scraps of cleanliness, while sermons and rumors stacked the odds against them. Step into a brothel now, and you notice the improvisation. A basin in the corner, half filled with water, used by several women in turn. Towels hanging by the hearth, reused until threadbare. Perfume bottles lined on a shelf, their contents more important than the water itself. Women take turns splashing faces, combing hair, and dusting powders, creating illusions of freshness that lasted just long enough for the night's work. You realize the irony. While scholars debate whether bathing truly disappeared, prostitutes didn't have the luxury of theory. They lived in a world of half-measures, partial washes, herbal scents, and constant suspicion. Their hygiene wasn't a philosophical question. It was a practical, daily compromise. As you step back into the night, you reflect on how fragile those compromises were. A splash of water, a sprinkle of powder, a dab of rosewater, all temporary shields against filth and judgment. And maybe you smile wryly at the thought. Even today, with hot showers and shampoos, people still sometimes spray perfume over yesterday's clothes and call it good. The medieval prostitute just played that game with higher stakes, harsher rules, and far less soap. You leave the riverside, where laundresses bend over their work, and your steps lead you back toward the brothel district, quieter now, but never fully asleep. Behind shuttered windows, voices still murmur, coins still clink, and bodies still shift under threadbare linen. Here, the subject turns from water and cloth to something even more intimate: the negotiations of desire, expectations, and survival tactics that defined the nightly work of prostitutes. Because hygiene wasn't just about looking or smelling. Presentably, it was about how intimacy itself was managed in a world where dirt clung to everyone and disease lurked in every breath. Imagine a candlelit chamber. The mattress is stuffed with straw that rustles when you sit on it. The air smells faintly of smoke, wine, and bodies. A prostitute leans closer to her client, smiling, her perfume faint but deliberate. Mainstream historical fact: intimacy in medieval prostitution wasn't framed in terms of pleasure the way modern culture imagines it. It was a transaction, a performance, and often a negotiation about what was tolerable under less than ideal conditions. Hygiene became part of that negotiation. A client might complain of a foul smell, and the woman would reach for a pomander, wave it under his nose, and laugh it off. Another might request that she wash quickly at a basin before beginning, while she might insist on payment first in case he recoiled and left. Quirky tidbit: some brothel records mention rules about washing before encounters, quick rinses of hands and faces, combing of hair, or even changing into a fresh shift if one was available. But these rules were unevenly enforced and often symbolic. You can imagine the comedy of a woman splashing her face in cold water, shaking droplets off like a cat, then turning with a practiced smile as though the ritual transformed her into Venus herself. Historians still argue whether medieval clients truly expected cleanliness or whether in a world where everyone stank, expectations were lower. Some suggest clients wanted prostitutes to appear cleaner than ordinary women, since they were paying for a lure. Others insist that filth was normalized, and perfumes or powders were more for atmosphere than hygiene. For prostitutes, the answer didn't matter. They had to play both sides, appearing as fresh as possible, while knowing full well their clients carried their own smells and lice into the room. Picture a negotiation now. A soldier, fresh from campaign, drops coins onto the table. His armor smells of rust, his breath of onions and ale. The prostitute smiles, steadying herself against the stink. She lights a sprig of rosemary, letting the smoke mingle with the air, and jokes about covering battlefield perfume. Humor itself was a survival tactic, a way of smoothing over discomfort and keeping the mood light despite the reality. Another scenario. A wealthy merchant demands kisses but grimaces at her breath. She quickly chews mint leaves she'd kept hidden in her sleeve, then leans back with exaggerated confidence, making a game of it. This constant improvisation masking odors, distracting with wit, reframing filth as flirtation was the art of survival. Hygiene wasn't just physical. It was psychological stagecraft. Quirky aside, some women carried small cloths soaked in vinegar or wine, dabbing their mouths before leaning in close. Vinegar was thought to disinfect, but it also gave the impression of freshness. Imagine puckering your lips after swabbing with vinegar, tasting sourness, then turning it into a sly joke about being sharp as wine. Even discomfort became part of the performance. But intimacy wasn't just about clients. Demands it was also about prostitutes protecting themselves. In a world without modern contraception, without reliable medicine, women developed their own survival tactics. Some used herbal pessaries wool, soaked in vinegar or mixtures of honey and garlic inserted as a barrier against pregnancy or infection. Were they effective? Historians still argue. Some remedies may have had antibacterial properties. Others were useless or harmful. But the act itself was a form of agency, a way of exerting control over bodies constantly exposed to risk. You sit now in a corner of the brothel common room, listening to the chatter. Prostitutes trade advice, chew parsley before kissing, sprinkle lavender on the sheets, refuse men who look too diseased. Yet refusal wasn't always possible. Survival often meant compromise, enduring unpleasantness, hoping for luck, and leaning on camaraderie when things went wrong. The intimacy here isn't just between women and clients. It's also among the women themselves, sharing strategies, laughing at absurdities, comforting one another after bad encounters. Historians still argue whether prostitutes enjoyed moments of genuine intimacy with certain clients, whether affection ever bloomed across the veil of transaction. Some accounts suggest it did, others dismiss it as myth. But what's clear is that hygiene shaped those dynamics. A client who bathed, who chewed cloves, who brought perfumes as gifts, might be remembered more fondly than one who reeked of fish and sweat. Hygiene wasn't just about appearance. It influenced the fragile lines between disgust, tolerance, and connection. Quirky tidbit again. Some prostitutes reportedly sprinkled powdered spices, like cinnamon or nutmeg, on their skin before intimacy, not only for scent, but also to give a faint, exotic impression. Imagine leaning close and smelling faintly like mulled weena. clever trick to turn ordinary encounters into something memorable. But spices were costly, so such gestures were rare luxuries, more likely when a generous client supplied them. Step outside the brothel again, and the night air feels no cleaner. The streets reek, the gutters run, the animals stir. Yet inside those rooms, candles flicker, and illusions hold if only for an hour. Prostitutes lived by those illusions, turning filth into fragrance, discomfort into charm, and risk into routine. Every negotiation, every whisper, every smile was another act of survival in a world where hygiene was never guaranteed. You pause at the edge of the square, reflecting. Intimacy here wasn't soft or sanitized. It was raw, improvised, and deeply human. Prostitutes turned bad breath into jokes, body odors into shared laughter, and even the threat of disease into rituals of prevention. They stitched together fragments of cleanliness, creating just enough illusion to carry on. And perhaps you sigh with recognition, because even today people dab on deodorant before dates, pop mints before kisses, and laugh nervously when things aren't perfect. The medieval prostitute just played that same game with higher stakes and fewer tools. You drift now toward the center of town, where the smell of parchment and sealing wax wafts from the council hall. This is where rules were made, where edicts were posted, and where the lives of prostitutes were written into law. Hygiene, for them, wasn't just a private struggle or a nightly performance. It was a matter of legislation. Cities across Europe tried to control prostitution through ordinances, inspections, and fines, often under the guise of protecting public health. But, as you'll soon see, enforcement was uneven, symbolic, and sometimes absurd. Step into the hall itself. Wooden benches creak as aldermen shuffle papers. A clerk reads aloud an ordinance. Brothel keepers must change bed straw once a week. Women must wash their faces before working. No one with visible sores may serve clients. Mainstream historical fact. Many cities issued such regulations. In 15th century Nuremberg, prostitutes were subject to inspections to ensure they weren't visibly diseased. In Florence, ordinances required brothel sheets to be laundered at regular intervals. But the reality behind the paperwork was murkier. Inspectors rarely visited on schedule. Brothel keepers cut corners and laundered. Sheets might mean nothing more than being shaken out the window. You step outside the hall and see a proclamation nailed to a post. It orders prostitutes to wear striped clothing or special veils so they can be identified, both for moral reasons and to protect citizens from accidental encounters. Hygiene here merges with control. The idea that prostitutes were walking sources of contagion, needing to be marked out from the rest of society. Historians still argue whether such dress codes were about actual disease prevention or simply moral theater. Either way, the effect was the same: women branded as unclean, even if they had just scrubbed their faces with rosewater. Quirky tidbit: in some cities, prostitutes were forbidden to bathe in public bathhouses at the same time as respectable women, on the grounds that they might spread disease through the water. Imagine the humiliation turning up at a bathhouse, only to be told you must wait outside, your very presence treated like contamination. Yet everyone knew the water itself was already filthy. The rule wasn't about hygiene, it was about stigma. You walk through a brothel district where a town official makes his rounds. He glances briefly into rooms, nods at the madam, and checks a list. The inspection lasts only minutes, but it gives the council its evidence of control. Prostitutes, meanwhile, tidy frantically beforehand, sheets shaken, perfume sprinkled, basins of water placed by the door. The ritual is more about appearances than cleanliness. Imagine being judged healthy or dirty in 10 seconds, based not on actual health, but on whether your shift looked fresh. Historians still argue whether these ordinances truly improved hygiene, or whether they were little more than bureaucratic pageantry. Some point to records of fines for unclean bedding as proof that at least some effort was made. Others counter that enforcement was sporadic, often influenced by bribery or favoritism. Prostitutes who paid off officials might be declared clean regardless of reality. Quirky aside, in certain towns, prostitutes were banned from handling food in markets because of fears they might contaminate it. Picture a woman reaching for a loaf of bread, only to have the baker snatch it back, declaring her hands unclean. Yet those same hands would be eagerly sought out by clients that night. The contradictions piled high, and hygiene was used as both weapon and excuse. You sit in a tavern now, listening to men discuss the ordinances. One scoffs at the idea of inspections, saying, if she looks fine, she is fine. Another insists the rules are necessary to protect honest men. None of them mention the women's perspectives. For prostitutes, the laws were dumb. They imposed humiliating restrictions, but also sometimes offered slim protections. A regulation requiring straw to be changed weekly might at least mean fewer fleas. A rule against diseased women working might offer some relief, but only if enforced, which it often wasn. Single quotes to stem. The women gather around, discussing the latest ordinance. Some roll their eyes. Another rule we can't follow. Others worry about the fines. The madam shrugs, calculating whether to pay inspectors off or actually replace the straw. Hygiene becomes paperwork, a bargaining chip, a performance staged for officials. True cleanliness remains out of reach. Historians still argue whether municipal brothels, owned or supervised by cities, were genuinely better maintained than private ones. Some records suggest they were sheets washed more often, water provided, inspections recorded. Others suggest they were equally filthy, the rules existing only on parchment. For prostitutes, the difference might have been minimal. A clean sheet once a month was still a dirty sheet 29 nights out of 30. Quirky tidbit, again, in some cities, prostitutes were required to carry health certificates signed by officials stating they were fit for work. Imagine flashing a parchment as proof of cleanliness, even while your clothes still smelled of smoke and sweat. The certificate was more about reassuring clients than protecting health. And of course, it could be forged or bought for a bribe. As you leave the district, you notice how ordinances shaped daily life. Prostitutes walked the streets, marked by clothing, restricted in movement, subject to inspections that rarely addressed the root problems. Hygiene became law, but law without teeth. And beneath it all, women improvised, as they always had, scrubbing what they could, perfuming what they couldn't, and surviving despite the gap between rules and reality. You pause at the edge of the square, reflecting on the absurdity. Laws demanded prostitutes be clean, but denied them the means to achieve it. Rules marked them as unclean, even when they managed rare moments of freshness, and officials who preached morality by day often crept into brothels by night. Perhaps you laugh softly at the irony, because if hygiene is supposed to be about health, the medieval ordinances turned it into theater, instead staged performances of cleanliness, written on parchment, shouted in the square, but rarely practiced in the straw-filled rooms where real women lived. And for the prostitutes trapped in that system, survival meant playing along, one ordinance at a time. You leave the council square, where ordinances flutter like paper shields against reality, and wander into quieter streets. The brothel lamps are dimmer now, the voices lower, the night inching toward dawn. Here you start to notice small hints of change, signs that attitudes toward cleanliness are beginning to shift, however slowly, because hygiene in the medieval world wasn't entirely stagnant. New ideas trickled in, soap making expanded, and people experimented with routines that foreshadowed modern habits. For prostitutes, these subtle shifts mattered, even if they arrived inconsistently. Picture a small workshop at the edge of town. Inside, soap makers stir great vats of rendered fat mixed with lye. The mixture bubbles and spits, giving off a sharp smell. Mainstream historical fact: soap existed in the Middle Ages, though it was harsh and expensive. In places like Marseille, a full-scale soap industries began developing by the 12th and 13th centuries, producing bars from olive oil and lye that were prized across Europe. For most people, though, soap was a luxury prostitutes might encounter it only occasionally, perhaps gifted by a wealthy client, or purchased rarely to keep up appearances. But even one bar, used sparingly, could stretch illusions of cleanliness further than rosewater alone. You pick up a piece of rough soap, gritty to the touch. Imagine rubbing it on your skin. It strips oils harshly, leaving your hands raw. Yet, compared to water alone, it feels revolutionary. Prostitutes who could access soap might save it for visible areas, hands, face, neck, rather than waste it on full washes. That small difference could mean the world in presenting an illusion of freshness. Historians still argue whether soap was used regularly by common folk or reserved mainly for laundry and special occasions. Either way, its spread planted the seeds of a cultural shift. Quirky tidbit: some recipes for medieval soaps included not just fat and ash, but herbs, milk, or even wine. Imagine lathering up with wine soap, hoping it smelled more refined than barnyard grease. For prostitutes, even the smallest indulgence of scented soap could transform their image, making them stand out from competitors who relied only on powders. Step into another room, and you find glass vessels lined up on a shelf. Distilled waters. The rise of alchemy and early chemistry introduced new methods of distilling herbs into liquids. Rosewater, lavender water, and other distillates became slightly more available in later medieval centuries. Prostitutes dabbed them on clothes, rinsed their mouths, or even sprinkled them on beds. Imagine a brothel chamber, faintly scented with lavender rather than stale straw. The illusion remained brief, but it hinted at the modern obsession with scent and cleanliness. Historians still argue whether these small advances in hygiene marked a genuine cultural shift or remained luxuries for the few. Some scholars point to inventories of brothels listing soap, perfumes, and fresh linens as evidence that standards improved. Others caution that such records reflect ideals more than reality. Still, the trajectory was there, a slow creep toward cleanliness as a social expectation. Prostitutes lived on that cusp, caught between old suspicions of bathing and new desires for freshness. You walk past a scribe's shop where pamphlets sit piled. One medical text, translated from Arabic, extols the benefits of regular washing, citing physicians like Avicenna. The Islamic world maintained stronger traditions of bathing and soap use, and some of those ideas filtered into Europe through trade and scholarship. Prostitutes in port cities, like Venice or Marseille, may have glimpsed travelers who smelled cleaner, carried scented soaps, or practiced regular ablutions. Exposure to such habits may have influenced local expectations, raising the bar for what clients desired. Quirky aside, one record from Paris mentions prostitutes rinsing with diluted wine before meeting clients, both as disinfectant and as cosmetic brightener. Imagine the sting on cracked lips, the sticky residue, the faint smell of alcohol, but also the impression of exotic luxury. Tiny gestures like this reveal how women improvised with whatever substances were at hand. Step into a brothel dormitory. Again, but notice what's changed. A basin sits filled with not just water, but soap flakes dissolved inside. A madam insists the women rinse their hands before bed. The sheets, though still worn, smell faintly of herbs. Perhaps it's not much, but compared to decades earlier, it marks progress. Prostitutes became unwilling participants in a slow evolution of hygiene culture, expected to embody freshness before most of society fully embraced it. Historians still argue whether prostitutes drove this shift or simply responded to it. Some claim their profession pushed innovations forward, since clients demanded allure. Others argue that broader cultural changes filtered into brothels like everywhere else. The truth may lie in the middle. Prostitutes both shaped and reflected the growing association of cleanliness with desirability. You step outside again, and the dawn air feels slightly fresher. The church bells toll, the market stirs, and the city prepares for another day. Hygiene remains a nightmare. Overall streets still stink, lice still crawl, water still poisons. But there are cracks of light, soap makers, stirring vats, alchemists, distilling herbs, physicians recommending washing, ordinances demanding cleaner sheets. For prostitutes, these changes didn't erase hardship, but they offered new tools, new illusions, new chances to survive. Quirky tidbit once more. Some late medieval texts even advised women to pluck armpit hair and wash with scented waters to improve attractiveness. Imagine the laughter in a brothel as women debated whether that advice was worth the effort. Still, it reveals a shift toward body management, a step closer to modern hygiene expectations. As you pause at the edge of town, you reflect on the irony. The medieval world often feared bathing, yet slowly embraced soaps. It distrusted water, yet distilled perfumes. It condemned prostitutes as unclean, yet relied on them to embody ideals of allure. Hygiene, in this context, wasn't linear progressive, was a dance of fear, improvisation, and slow innovation. And maybe you smile faintly, realizing that even in the darkest corners of history, people kept reaching for small comforts. A bar of soap, a dab of rosewater, a basin of clean water. Prostitutes, more than most, carried those fragile comforts forward, stitching them into their survival. You return at last to the brothel quarter, where the candles burn low, the streets grow silent, and the sky begins to pale with the first hints of dawn. The city has cycled through another night of business, prayer, filth, and compromise. Now comes the moment of reflection, the final weaving together of the threads you've followed, the dirt of the streets, the tricks of perfumes, the endless labor of laundresses, the hypocrisy of sermons, the desperation of remedies, and the slow, stumbling shift toward something resembling modern hygiene. For prostitutes, every one of these pieces shaped not just how they smelled or looked, but how they survived, judged constantly by a society that needed them and scorned them in equal measure. Step back inside, a chamber one more time. The straw mattress is damp, the sheets worn thin, the air heavy with the layered scents of smoke, sweat, and rosewater. A woman sits at the edge of the bed, untying the scarf from her hair. Her body aches. She scratches absent-mindedly at a flea bite, winces at the soreness in her mouth, then reaches for a small vial of vinegar to rinse. Mainstream historical fact at the close of their workday. Many prostitutes likely attempted small acts of self-care, wiping down with water, chewing herbs, or simply collapsing into bed, too exhausted to fight the grime. For them, hygiene wasn't an endpoint but a cycle, repeating daily with little chance of real relief. She stretches her legs, revealing stockings patched so many times they're more stitch than fabric. Quirky tidbit: some women sprinkled powdered herbs between their toes to combat the stench of long hours in boots or slippers. You imagine the sharp tingle of mint or sage, a tiny comfort in a life where comfort was rare. These improvisations were never enough to erase filth entirely, but they gave the illusion of control. And in a trade built on illusion, even the smallest gestures mattered. Historians still argue whether prostitutes were truly dirtier than other medieval women, or whether they were simply portrayed that way by moralists eager to stigmatize them. Archaeological evidence shows lice, fleas, and poor dental health were common across all classes. Yet prostitutes carried the burden of being visibly and symbolically associated with uncleanliness. In sermons, in ordinances, in gossip, they became scapegoats for problems that affected everyone. Their hygiene nightmare was not unique, but it was uniquely judged. Step outside into the gray dawn. The streets are quieter now, though refuse still litters the gutters. A cart rumbles by, carrying waste to the outskirts of town. Dogs nose at piles of scraps. A beggar stirs in a doorway. The city smells no sweeter, but the air feels cooler, gentler. Prostitutes walk home or curl into corners of brothels, seeking sleep. Their bodies, marked by the night's work, carry the residue of perfume, sweat, smoke, and touch. The cycle will begin again by evening. Quirky aside, some brothels were even located near churches, so women could slip into morning mass after a night of work, attempting to wash sin from soul, if not from body. Imagine the juxtaposition: kneeling in a pew, incense in the air, while still smelling faintly of last night's client. The line between sacred and profane blurred, with hygiene and morality tangled in every gesture. You linger, thinking of all you've seen on this walk: the filth, of rivers, doubling as laundries and latrines, the powders and perfumes masking sweat, the lice combs scraping scalps raw, the garlic-laden stews shaping breath and body odors, the mercury ointments meant to cure but poisoning instead, the laws demanding cleanliness without providing water, the soap makers, the herbalists, the apothecaries selling crocodile dung and powdered pearls, the soldiers bringing lice, the pilgrims bringing rashes, the merchants bringing garlic sweat, and through it all, prostitutes laughing, joking, improvising, turning filth into flirtation, turning survival into performance. Historians still argue whether this gradual layering of remedies and illusions actually improved health or simply improved appearances. Did rose water and vinegar truly protect against infection? Did soap make enough of a difference when streets still reeked of dung? Did perfumes simply add another odor to the mix? For prostitutes, the answers mattered less than the effect on clients. Hygiene was measured not by medical outcomes, but by coins dropped into a palm. You step away from the brothel district now, the bells tolling softly in the distance. The city stretches and yawns awake. Bakers stoke fires, merchants set up stalls, priests prepare sermons. For you, the walk has been exhausting, overwhelming, full of images and smells that cling even in imagination. For prostitutes, it was simply life. Another night survived in the balance between allure and filth, between laughter and disease. And maybe you chuckle quietly as you think of your own nightly routines: hot showers, toothbrushes, deodorant, clean sheets. The medieval prostitute would have killed for such luxuries. Instead, she managed with vinegar rinses, sand for scrubbing, perfumes made from cat musk, and endless buckets of dirty water. Hygiene was never perfect, but she made it work long enough to keep living, laughing, and enduring. Now the journey slows. The dawn light softens, stretching across rooftops and cobblestones in long golden streaks. The city you've wandered through all night settles into stillness, the worst smells fading into the cool morning air. You can almost hear the hush that follows a night of chaos, the footsteps quiet, the voices stilled, the brothels finally resting. The cycle of grime and perfume, of water hauled and powders dabbed, pauses for just a moment. You imagine yourself lying back now, the straw mattress replaced by something softer, the candle smoke replaced by the faint hum of your own room. The images of lice, combs, vinegar rinses, and perfumed scarves drift away, fading like mist at sunrise. The weight of the night lifts, leaving only curiosity behind. The people you've met in these stories, women negotiating survival, men stumbling through alleys, laundresses scrubbing at rivers, become distant figures. Their voices softer, their laughter fading. Let your breath slow, deeper, and calmer. Feel the rhythm settle, like the river smoothing after stones are thrown. The medieval world you've just explored was harsh, noisy, and dirty, but now it quiets, and you can let it go. The grime stays in the past, the smells dissolve, and only the gentle flow of history remains, carrying you toward rest as you drift. Hold on to the thought. Even in the filthiest streets, even in the harshest judgments, people found ways to laugh, to endure, to improvise. And tonight, as you close your eyes, you can let their resilience be your lullaby, a reminder that history isn't just dust and dirt, but also strength and spirit. So close your eyes, breathe softly, and let sleep carry you gently into its clean, quiet embrace.